thank you for that kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank IAEA, the organizers, for including me in this session. We began planning this conference over a year ago. And from my point of view, the reason I believe that was important is it was a very participatory process involving a range of stakeholders from a range of organizations. And I think this is reflected not simply in the session one this morning, but in the overall program. I'd like to, by name, acknowledge our two rapporteurs, Rebecca Brown, who is from the MAM Forum, and Jeremy Shohan from the Emergency Nutrition Network. They're going to be doing a lot of the hard work. This session is meant to frame the issues that we will be discussing over the next 3 days. And as I was listening yesterday to the opening session, it occurred to me that in very different ways, the different presenters were talking really about two broad categories of issues that I think will transcend all the presentations. One is, what do we know? And the second category I think that we'll see running throughout the 3 days is, where are the gaps? And so with those two overarching ways of categorizing the issues, we'll start this morning with what I call 3 keynote presentations. The first from Francesco Branca, looking at the global crisis of MAM. What do we know? What are the gaps? Followed by Patrick Webb's discussion of meta-analyses he's been involved in, what works, what don't we know. And then the third of the keynotes will be on maternal malnutrition by Dr. Bhutta. Panel 1 will follow on these keynotes and talk about, from a UN perspective, how does the UN engage in the whole issue of moderate acute malnutrition, and what are some of the challenges going forward. And I think for me, the key part of this morning is ending with a panel with country representatives, where individuals from 3 different countries, and what I call boots on the ground, they're out there actually working to prevent and treat MAM. We'll talk about 3 different, quite different country experiences and the challenges going forward. So there's a lot of energy in the room. I can feel it. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who probably at least 2/3 of the audience knows, Dr. Francesco Branca, who is director of the Nutrition Division at the World Health Organization. I was trying to think, Francesco, when we first met, and I think it was probably, as I hobbled up to the podium, Lola, it was probably 30 years ago. I first met Francesco when he was working at the Nutrition Institute in Rome on a variety of things, including seasonality. And yesterday, the light bulb went off when David Nabarro was talking about periods during the year where you see growth declines. I have to say, Francesco, you were a researcher ahead of your time. And so over 30 years we've collaborated, and not only is he a colleague but a friend. With that, Francesco, I'll turn the podium over to you.
Thank you very much, Eileen, for this wonderful introduction. Indeed, there were good times when at the Institute of Nutrition in Rome we were studying. Now the Institute of Nutrition in Rome doesn't exist anymore, and there's no more studies. So unfortunately, our work has not been particularly impactful at least in the Italian research scenario. But maybe the times will change. I would like really to thank Najat and her team to have invited me, to have organized this meeting, and for the great collaboration that IAEA has with the UN family in general, with WHO in particular, on several important topics. Today, I'm asked to talk about the global crisis of moderate acute malnutrition. So I thought I would give you just 4 thoughts. First of all, we start with the definition. That's the official WHO definition. It's based on anthropometry, weight and height. Weight for age between -3 and -2 Z-score below the median of the WHO child growth standards, and it can be due to a low weight for height or a low height for age, or a combination of both. And you have the table downstairs. Below, you have also cut-off points based on medium armor up circumference, so we have an anthropometric definition. So, I'll tell you about this based on this definition, although I would like to challenge a little bit this definition. First of all, what are the latest data we have on these different forms of malnutrition? Now WHO works very closely with UNICEF and World Bank to bring together all the data we have from countries. So we have yearly updates. The updates come every September, and they, of course, refer to the previous year. So we still don't have the 2013 estimates. I'm going to give you the 2012 estimates. But you see, 2012 we had 162 million children under 5 with stunting. And this is the whole of the stunting, so include the moderate and the severe stunting, 162. 25%. The World Health Assembly established a target for 2025, which is to reduce by 40% the number of stunted children. So that would mean that by 2025 we would like to see not more than 100 million children, which is still a huge amount, but still would represent an important decrease. But as you can see, we don't seem to be on track on that reduction. So, but anyway, this is the first figure I'd like you to have in mind, 162. How many of them are moderate, how many of them are severe? We haven't actually done the calculation in WHO. We have, I think, several pieces of work done in different contexts. I would say that roughly half, but please challenge me on that, are actually moderately stunted. Then the next one is the wasting. And here we have actually made the distinction between the wasting in general and the severe wasting. So the difference, of course, would be the moderate wasting. You see here, this is in numbers of children, and the total of the wasted is 51, or was 51 million in 2012. It's been fluctuating. We can't really describe trends on wasting. It's difficult to describe trends because this is so fluctuating so quickly. And the severe wasting would be 17 million. So you see about 2-to-1 ratio. And if you look at the colors, you will immediately see that the distribution is very uneven in different parts of the world. And Asia really has the largest number of wasted children. So shall we say that out of the 51 million, then approximately 34 million are the moderately wasted. So we have 162 million, probably half are wasted, and 42. 34 would be the wasted. So what is the total number of the moderately malnourished children? And this is the distribution. This is actually a map that it will see. It says not yet for release. This is a tool that WHO is preparing to map to track the progress in achieving the targets. So one of the outputs is a map, and this is a map of wasting, the total wasting. So you see, as you can expect, Asia, particularly India, Sub-Saharan Africa. But of course, in terms of numbers, the Asian countries are much larger in terms of population. So 69% of wasting is in Asia, 69%. We can drill a bit more in detail and see what is the prevalence of wasting in the different regions of the world. And this slide tells you where are the children in terms of numbers in the different regions of the world. So you can immediately see that, of course, the Asian countries are the ones where you have the largest number, but where you also have the largest variability, big variability between countries. And looking at the variability between countries, we know that some countries have prevalences of wasting under 5, still important prevalence of wasting. Some other countries have prevalence of wasting which are exceeding 10%, but you have even countries, and you have here the list of the 9 countries where the prevalence of wasting is above the third quartile, so above 15%, 15.7 actually percent. So in these 9 countries you have prevalence of wasting, and this is again including both the moderate and the severe, but the prevalence of wasting is about 15.7%. So in those 9 countries we have 55% of the wasted children. So large variability and concentration in some countries. But the story of variability is not finished, because we also have to consider that there are important socioeconomic differences in moderate malnutrition. Now, I'm sorry, I'm switching from wasting to stunting according to where the data are. We don't have good data about, or I couldn't find good data about socioeconomic distribution of moderate wasting, but I could find some data from the World Bank on the socioeconomic differences in moderate stunting. And you can see, this is based on the high quartile or the low quartile versus the high quartile of income, and different parts of the world are different. Globally, the ratio between the low income and the high income is about 2 times in the world. But you see there are some parts of the world, like Latin America and the Caribbean, where this discrepancy is huge. At least it was, because some of the countries in Latin America, as you know, have really realized the disruptive power of these socioeconomic differences and are taking action there. But these data are sort of before the 2005, more or less, and you see that in Latin America and the Caribbean there was a 5-time difference in prevalence of moderate wasting between the poor and the rich. So huge socioeconomic differences. Well, Aileen very kindly referred to our work on seasonality. Indeed, you can still see a lot of countries in the world, particularly the sub-Saharan Africa, where you have incredible changes in seasonal rates. And this affects wasting, of course, but it also affects actually growth rates. And you have big discrepancies. So we have to be very careful when we do the measurements to really understand the magnitude of the problem. So in countries that have high endemic rates of wasting, we can also see that during the hungry season, the lean season, these rates can skyrocket, really. So that's really my first point, trying to give you some parameters of the magnitude of the issue. The second point I want to make is that actually these metrics we are using are probably not entirely correct and are not providing us the true picture of the issue. Well, first of all, wasting and stunting are interconnected. They're coexisting in the same child, and several episodes of wasting may lead to growth arrest and therefore to easier stunting, and you all have the Leonardo Matas growth charts in mind, I'm sure. There is evidence really that episodes of wasting in the previous 3 months have a big impact on attained length for age. Mike will say, well, it was depending on the amount of fat that it controls growth. So there are biological and epidemiological data indicating the two connections, the two conditions are closely linked. So we really need to look at them in an integrated fashion. Plus we have the macronutrient deficiencies. That's not another category. We say macronutrient deficiency, well, at least 2 billion people in the world are affected by that. Well, actually it's a bit more. But we certainly need to consider that in moderate malnutrition you have a lot of vitamin and mineral deficiencies that need to be considered as part of the condition, particularly vitamin A, folic acid, riboflavin, vitamin C, thiamine, vitamin D, E and K, and Alan will hopefully expand on these associations. So I think we need to do a better job in describing the condition, and so in terms of numbers and in terms of phenomena and nutrition deficiencies that are part of it. My third point is about comparing. How can we say this is a crisis? And we can use mortality and disability as a way to compare this with other conditions. Well, we know that wasting under 5 seems to be responsible for 875,000 deaths. That was the latest analysis of the burden of disease. That means 12.6% of total deaths of children under 5 years. The severe wasting is 516,000. So, calculate the difference. That's what moderate wasting is about. Again, that's not part of the whole story. When the first analysis of the burden of disease was done in 1990, childhood underweight, which is probably the closest proxy to the moderate malnutrition, was number one risk factor for poor health. And no surprise that in Millennium Development Goal, when they were formulated, Goal 1 had actually, under eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, underweight as a clear target. And the target was to halve between 1990 and 2015 the proportion of people who suffer from hunger. If you look at the latest burden of disease analysis, this is Lancet the analysis done for 2010, published in 2012, the picture has actually changed, and childhood underweight is only number 8 in the list. Well, still extremely high, and still, but you see the top of the list, we have high blood pressure, so we definitely have, the epidemiologic transition with the non-communicable diseases, and a lot of the nutrition-related conditions that have become more relevant globally. So the high BMI, in fact, accounted for about 4% of global disability-adjusted life years. And altogether, all the dietary risk factors account for 10% of global DALYs. So quite an important amount in terms of global burden. And no surprise that also the attention, in a sense, is shifting in the discussion of nutrition. But still, childhood underweight, as we said, 860,000 deaths, 3.1% DALYs, and looking at the different causes of death for maternal and child malnutrition, certainly the childhood underweight is on top of the list. But this situation is not the same in different, all over the world. So we have some part of the world where still childhood underweight is far the most important cause of death and disabilities. And this is the slide again, analysis for 2010 for Central and Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is the magnitude of the problem. It's of course still one of the top causes of death. It's still extremely relevant compared to other nutrition conditions, but with geographical differences. And again, changing in importance. And that means that we need to also to reconsider our discourse on nutrition. Well, my last point is, what is the global attention then to the issue? And I think there's still remarkable global attention. This is the list of the 6 global nutrition targets that World Health Assembly approved in 2012. They are very ambitious but realistic, based on the best performance of countries. There are 6: the reduction of stunting, the reduction of maternal anemia, the reduction of low birth weight, the halting the epidemic of childhood obesity, the improvement of breastfeeding rate, and the reduction of wasting. And for stunting, we can say that the ambition is to reduce the number of stunted children by 40% by year 2025, and for wasting, that we would not like to see any country really with a prevalence of wasting above 5%. So these are the targets that have been established, and you see the numbers there that would be reached if the necessary and known interventions are implemented at scale in all countries with a burden of these conditions. This is, as I was saying, a tracking tool which we are making available for countries to calculate their own targets and then to see what progress they are doing. At the moment, we have an analysis. This is Gretchen Stevens and Majid Edzadi's analysis of the probability of these different countries in the world to achieve that underweight reduction, that MDG1 target. And you see there's a lot of reds there. So many of those countries in the world with a high burden of moderate malnutrition will not be able to make it. So definitely, although the discourse is changing, still the priority is there, and still in post-2015 we need to consider the reduction of malnutrition as the unfinished agenda and as one of the important elements that hopefully member states will accept to put high on the political agenda. So this is my analysis of basically the relevance of the issue and importance. And well, I think we all have these 3 days to think of what we can do to address these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesco. Before you leave the podium, you've been superb in your presentation, but also in keeping on time. So we have a minute or so for 1 or 2 clarifying questions. Later on this morning, we'll have a broader question and answer session with all of the presenters. Are there 1 or 2 questions, points of clarification? And if you would use the microphone, please, and indicate who you are and your organization. Thank you.
I'm Andre Bria. I am an independent pensioner. Congratulations, Francisco, for your presentation. I just wanted to make a point about the assessment of MAM burden. I mean, all the statistics you presented are based on prevalence data. This is fine for comparing one country to the other. But in terms of assessing the burden of an acute disease, such as wasting, which is an acute short transient condition, I think measuring prevalence is inappropriate, and it would be wise to consider moving to measuring incidence.
Thank you, Andre. This is a very important point, and particularly for of course, wasting. It would be important to have the incidence, or maybe also to have some data about changes in growth rate. This is something certainly we need to do at primary care level. We need to identify the issue before it's actually consolidated. So I quite agree with you. I think we have major limitation in our capacity to describe the issue. And we also have major limitation in the capacity to have continuous data. I mean, this yearly updates for many countries are not adequate. We need to have more often information, and we need to be able to act more promptly. So thank you. Yes.
Last question from Dr. Butta.
So my question is complementary to Andre's and relates to this association between wasting and stunting. So I do think, Francesco, there is an opportunity now with so many cohorts being available contemporaneously in the last 5 years from studies done across geographies, where it is possible to see longitudinally from birth cohorts as to what's happened in terms of transition in nutritional state of infants in various contexts, with disease, without disease, various types of nutrient intake, of how kids go in and out of various states of wasting, and what the overlap with stunting is. what I find as a practitioner and also, in interfacing with policymakers, very confusing is the message that we give on different interventions for wasting and different interventions for stunting, and particularly the early period, the first 6 to 10 months. So I think the data are there. What it requires is perhaps the global position of WHO in terms of assembling people to use some of that data for this kind of analysis, which is possible within the information that we have.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in fact, I think the fact that we have now targets on wasting, stunting, and low birth weight and is starting to show the interconnection. We need to also understand what is the relevance of that early in utero malnutrition and what is the impact on those wasting and stunting grades. So yes, point well taken.
Thank you, Francesco. Why don't I begin the introduction while this is being pulled up? I should emphasize we're going to have a lot more time at the end of this morning's session for questions and discussion, so this is not it. Before we began, Dr. Patrick Webb leaned over to me and says, "Don't read my bio." So I'm going to read it, Patrick. No, I've been privileged to work with Patrick Webb in 2 organizations. We worked together in IFPRI as research fellows, and now at Tufts, Patrick is the Dean of Academic Affairs. I try to think of something I can tell an audience they may not know about the speaker, and Patrick is well aware that he has 3 sons, but what he may not be aware of is de facto he has a daughter. And this relates back to a comment Lola made earlier. In the early years of my children's life, they spent a lot of time overseas. My second daughter, Rachel, came over with me into a research site when she was she was 6 weeks old. Patrick visited shortly afterwards, and while I was Mama Jen, which is my first daughter, Patrick became Papa Rachel. So you actually have 3 boys and a girl. And with that, I'll turn it over to Patrick Webb.
Thank you, Eileen. I think that's that's called throwing the speaker off right at the beginning. Scott, good morning. Wonderful. Thank you to the organisers for the invitation, for being able to be here. Now, I'm going to be kicking off what I hope will be a vibrant discussion during the coming days on evidence, the nature of evidence, what we think we know, what we think we need, and what we know we want. And I think it's very, very important today to understand that we can't allow credible evidence to be undermined by advocacy that itself is not evidence-based. And we have to work hard, perhaps even harder than ever, to ensure that we are informing advocacy, as Eileen was saying yesterday, with the most credible evidence and not allowing our evidence to be undermined. And I'm going to start with a book that's been making quite a splash both sides of the pond of late, bestseller by an economist who's been focusing on the importance of income inequality through time. And the reason I'm starting here is that as I flew over on Sunday reading the Financial Times, there was a big piece relating to the chief economist of the Financial Times, who claims that that book is based on flawed data and therefore the arguments contained are untrustworthy. And it's based on an investigation by the Financial Times into the database for the arguments, not the arguments themselves, nor less the interpretation of those arguments, but the database made available by the author. And the kind of things that they point out as being evidence of weakness in the argument are unexplained adjustments to numbers and data entries with no sourcing and unexplained time differences and inconsistent use of data. Ooh, scary stuff. So my obvious point is that anyone going forward with a strong case to make potentially lays themselves open to undermining based on the wrong reasons. The wrong reasons in this case being nitpicking around individual pieces, individual lines of data that in reality are trivial to the overall interpretation and analysis, but lay themselves open to other interpretations. Now, a lot has happened in the 8 years since Rainer Gross, to whom I dedicate this talk, pointed out that we've got to stop wasting time for wasted children, and he was really focusing not just on SAM but on moderate and mild, and the importance of not only looking at emergencies but how it plays out in development, that this is a development agenda, the fact that we need codex standards for products used, that we have to look at the long term. How do we resolve wasting by treating it as a development problem, something that Jeremy Shoham and others at ENN have called for recently, a paradigm shift in the way we understand wasting within the overall panoply of nutrition problems. And that governments themselves need to take this on, and that part of that resides in requiring results-oriented, what he means, what we would now call evidence-based actions at the policy level, so that we can do what's needed. Now, results, evidence in the context of emergencies have traditionally, for example, been extremely hard. We want hard evidence. Hard has two meanings. Hard means that it's concrete, it's empirically sound. It can also be quite hard to collect. Now, this one example from the Global Nutrition Cluster, the harmonized training package, they refer to a case, a supplementary feeding program in response to the Haiti earthquake, for example, that I know Dr. Maron was directly involved in, aimed at preventing a deterioration of nutritional status. Younger kids getting supplementary plumpy, older kids getting the more conventional fortified blended foods, oil and sugar and so on. And the conclusion that is given at the end of that particular example, there's a recognition that it's very difficult to attribute impact, especially in this context, also in the context where nutrition programming is happening with other sectors, it's not happening alone. And the conclusion is that low levels of moderate and severe acute malnutrition, they were around 6% 5 months after the earthquake. They were actually around 6% before the earthquake. That suggests that these nutrition interventions averted a deterioration of the nutrition situation. Well, maybe, maybe not. It's very hard to tease out what the contribution was, simply basing on a before and after large-scale survey. So on the one hand, it's very hard to prove that nothing changed because of your intervention. Try doing that. The counterfactual is really hard to prove in any convincing way. But it's also very hard to prove that your intervention did achieve the goal, and that's essentially what we're concerned with here. Now, why we're focusing on this is that right now there's lots of recent statements around the paucity of concrete evidence about what works around MAM, and less so on SAM, but around MAM, and humanitarian response more generally, that the database, the evidence base is extremely lacking, that there's a dearth or a dearth. I never know whether you pronounce it as dearth or darth. I'm not sure. It should be whether it's one or the other. It's probably dearth of evidence. And that the type of research currently published fails to answer the questions that we want answered. That's just to avoid the jet lag kicking in. So the focus here, I'm not actually going to be talking about whey protein versus soy protein, which a lot of people have expected me to talk about. The focus here is on what can we garner from existing systematic reviews? And there are a lot, not just these. I've had to cut out slides. I don't even mention some of Kay Dewey's work and her colleagues and others. There's a lot of systematic reviews recently focusing on SAM, on MAM, on both, on food products of many kinds, comparing many different kinds of food products. But some people ask me, well, why bother on systematic reviews? They just deal with RCTs and they don't really have any bearing on programming and policy. Well, wrong on both counts. They're not just about RCTs. In this set of just 6 here that I've pulled out, yes, they do include in their search terms for finding the evidence that are included in the analyses, they include RCTs, but they also include other forms of cohort with control and retrospective case control, and then before and after and interrupted time series, and even no restriction on the actual study design. And so they're not just about RCTs, number one. The real important point that I think often gets missed in terms of systematic reviews, that I think is a huge contribution to what we should be understanding about the literature, is the risk of bias, and hence the confidence we have in elements of the study. Not just study design, but elements of the study. Now, most systematic reviews have these kinds of charts where they basically look at the number of studies down the vertical axis, and 7 or more sometimes different possible elements of risk to credibility of the outcomes that are being proposed. And the green means there's high confidence that there's low bias. But yet, even in this one example, there's not one of those studies that has a clean bill of health, that is green all the way across. Red means there is identification of a serious risk of bias. Those are the ones we really need to be avoiding. What worries me is the number of yellows with the question marks which are documented unclear risk of bias. Now, these unclear risks of bias within the study, they just mean that things have not been reported adequately or transparently or at all. Those are major sources of the conclusions of so many systematic reviews that we cannot make firm conclusions from the evidence. And this is crazy, that today we are still allowing this to happen. And it doesn't matter how many studies you include in a systematic review, you will see that there's far too many reds, far too many oranges and yellows. And this is this inherent source of uncertainty, which really is not framed necessarily by study design, but by presentation of results, and we can talk about why that is happening, is a big problem. And even in some of your great studies, many of the studies included in these are done by people I most admire in the field who are in this room, who have elements in their studies that have been identified in systematic reviews as either low, moderate risk, actually not low risk, moderate risk or unclear risk. And we have to do better. Now, there's conventional presentation through all the various systematic reviews using forest plots of many different kinds. Depends on the number of studies included in the systematic reviews. Too few is one of the conclusions. The importance here, though, again, of systematic reviews is the confidence intervals. I think we really ought to be paying more attention not just to the point estimates of relative risk, but to the confidence intervals around those points, to be, again, understanding what are the sources of risk and what are the sources of uncertainty in our interpretation. Now, despite very different inclusion factors for these different systematic reviews, very different time frames in their search base. Some start in 1970, some start in 1936, some start in 1988. Right? So they're searching different pools of evidence. They have different inclusion factors, as we saw, different approaches to trying to approach meta-analysis. The bottom line is that they're very similar in their conclusions across the existing set of systematic reviews. There are, I have to caveat, many new studies that have just been published that are not included in these systematic reviews or are about to be published, and we're going to know a lot more in the next couple of years than we currently do, but right now this is where we are today. So common findings are that the various food supplements used in or tried, compared in, and there are many, many different kinds of foods compared in the studies assessed, food supplements work. Right? So some form of food supplementation in combination with whatever else is going on in the management of MAM, treatment of SAM, there is enough evidence, good evidence, to suggest that it works compared with, say, simply behavior change compared with doing nothing at all. Food works. There is also evidence growing that lipid-based, ready-to-use foods of various kinds actually perform statistically significantly better in terms of speed of recovery and weight gain per day. There is growing evidence. There's enough there to be able to say relatively confidently that for these two outcomes, we have the evidence that these products work. However, on other metrics of, let's say, recovery or treatment, for example, mortality or default or progression from MAM to SAM, we have much less confidence. Actually, most results can suggest not significant difference in terms of different kinds of foods used or different types of treatments. We know far too little still about what's going on in these subgroups, especially, for example, progression from MAM to SAM. Now, other things that are commonly stated across these systematic reviews are quite sad. There are too few studies that can be included in these reviews to allow confident generalization. That comes up over and over again. Simply too few studies that meet the inclusion criteria that can be included and therefore form the body of evidence using the standards of systematic review. And too few of those studies are outside of a handful of countries in Africa. We heard that Asia is the base, has the highest numbers of wasted kids. Very few studies outside of Africa, in Asia or Latin America. The quality of evidence, as I said, very often low or unclear. This is fixable, and we can talk about how to fix that. But heterogeneity in terms of the kinds of populations included in the studies often prevents meta-analysis. The pooling of data that allows us to do effective meta-analysis, especially of subgroups within those populations, has simply been a major constraint, and every single systematic review highlights that. Now, the sources of that heterogeneity, well, some of it has been mentioned. There are different ways of defining wasting that have been used over the years, especially if you start in 1936 and go forward. But there are different studies have been using different inclusion criteria, grade 2 in studies in India, Gomez, weight for age, sometimes including mild, not just moderate. Defining recovery. Recovery is something we need to talk about a lot this week, I would argue. There are some studies that had no time frame, no limit on the number of weeks of treatment. Others had 8, others had 16, some weight for height or some threshold. Some used highly trained researchers as the implementers. Others used existing health post staff. And the source of unclarity relates to the metrics that are reported or not. Progression to SAM, daily weight gain, default, subgroups, and costs, all of these typically not standard in terms of what is collected and what is reported. So when you have this kind of heterogeneity, it makes it actually impossible to pool data because the data are not comparable. And this is a source of constraint, and we can and should do better. So just picking out almost at random some of the conclusions from these systematic reviews, it makes poor reading. We can't reach conclusions, we can't generalize, we can't reach firm conclusions. There are gaps in our ability to estimate the effectiveness, and we have incomplete data to make conclusions. That's kind of sad, but we can do better. And I think this meeting is an important way forward. We need to identify what is it that we want and need, and how are we going to collectively ensure not just in study design improvements, but reporting improvements. How are we going to ensure that going forward we're not stuck in the same situation as Tom Piketty? His response, by the way, to the Financial Times critique was that, look, you know, we have the data that we have, and right now we have a diverse and heterogeneous data set. In some ways, that's the same place that we are at in terms of the wasting evidence, but that doesn't mean we can stop here. Quite the contrary. On the one hand, we have to On the one hand, we have to fill those gaps. On the other hand, there are a lot of areas where we need to tailor evidence collection and reporting to things that seem to matter. Now, all of these are commonly cited gaps of evidence going forward that the systematic review authors have highlighted. Seasonality and incidence just came up as issues. Longer-term follow-up. What do we really know what recovery means? Not just exit from a treatment, but recovery. What's happening to body composition? What's happening to gut health through different kinds of treatments? Subgroup analysis. Being able to understand different subgroups within populations, how they're acting or not acting differently. Some people arguing that we should actually be assessing cognitive outcomes, the impairment that goes not just with stunting but with wasting. This is all about breaking down silos and trying to build wasting into our common agenda as a development agenda. And of course, costing, cost-effectiveness studies, Chloe Puett has been leading here in many ways, but everyone is demanding for understanding what works in cost-effectively, not simply in efficacy settings. So wasting is and has to be seen as a development issue more broadly. We have to break down the silo. It's not just about SAM, it's about MAM and mild, moderate. It's about how that interplays, as Zulfi just said, with stunting. It's not something that is just about emergencies or non-emergencies. This is a nutrition problem, and it has to be addressed as such. It has to be addressed in ways where funding is made sustainable, and some of that requires quality evidence to be able to make the case, the advocacy case for policy and political support. Action can't wait, and we're going to hear from the UN agencies on what is being done, and I would argue one of the evidence gaps is real evidence of what is being done, not simply trials of different products, but actually programming experiences and the cost effectiveness thereof. But we have to then promote donor and government demand and therefore support for quality of evidence. This isn't going to happen by itself. It's expensive, it's difficult, it's complex, but we collectively have to make the case. We have to be the advocates for quality, and I think this is the right community and the right venue to do so. Thank you.
Patrick, in order to get us back on time, I'd like to defer questions and discussion until later on this morning. Thank you. So while we are pulling up the next presentation, I was reminded, Patrick, that I was reminded that when the launch of Sun took place, one of the lightning rods was, do we have enough evidence to proceed? So it's always this dilemma, you know, what do we do at any point in time versus continuing to have better evidence? I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, who wears many, many hats, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. He is a professor and founding director of the Center of Excellence in Women and Child Health, Aga Khan University. But from my point of view, equally important, or maybe even more important, Dr. Buddha was one of the prime architects of both Lancet Series 1 and Lancet Series 2. And in research we've been doing in looking at governance issues, almost to the last person we interview, talking about how did you get where you are in your country as far as orientation, they bring up the Lancet series as having been a critical component of we do have evidence and helping them craft the various approaches. So the emphasis of Dr. Budu goes well beyond your own individual research. You really are a champion of change. And with that, I'll hand the podium to you.
Thank you very much for those kind words, Eileen. And had I known that Patrick was going to show a picture of Darth Vader, I would have put up a picture of Star Trek, my favorite series. Why? Because it could beam people from one place to the other rather than force them to take overnight flights across the Atlantic. So ladies and gentlemen, what I've been asked to do is to do the impossible, is to talk to you about maternal malnutrition in the context of its impacts on both maternal outcomes and childhood malnutrition. And this is an area where if you were to take the vast amount of work that's taken place in childhood wasting and malnutrition, as Patrick alluded to, unfortunately there's been very little work. So we kind of run on fumes when we talk about maternal malnutrition, given the evidence that we have. So I am specifically going to restrict my presentation to what are the recent data that we have around the importance of this area, where are some of the gaps, some of the exciting emerging opportunities, and where we perhaps ought to go. And I am not fearing Patrick's presence here to give you any data from systematic reviews, because they are so pitifully meager and also of poor quality. The Lancet series that we had last year, the second in the sequence, put this conceptual framework forward. And if you look at this conceptual framework, complex as it is, it made a couple of very important advances. Firstly, it recognized the value of nutrition-specific interventions, but also a lot of the nutrition-sensitive and the environmental issues that relate to how nutrition changes. The other new element that was threaded in the series, and just the beginnings of it, because we didn't have a lot of data, was to go beyond survival, stunting, wasting, to developmental potential. And I think that's where a lot of the meat is in the context of looking at nutrition across the life cycle. Again, when we put these life cycle graphs up and get you to see them, it creates this false impression that our knowledge of both the risks as well as the interventions across the life cycle or the life course are of equal magnitude. They are not. We know a lot more about what happens around here, a lot less of what happens around adolescence, the transition from childhood to adolescence, very little between adolescence and pregnancy, and we know something about women of reproductive age. But then again, disaggregated data around the impact of nutrition, particularly in the younger age women, adolescents to young women, is just remarkably poor, both from the epidemiology, burden, risks, and also importantly, interventions. So I'm going to give you a little bit from our work last year around what we know and what we don't know. And let's start with adolescent nutrition. So the first thing that we discovered when we tried to put together the data around this is that there are no globally representative data. There are just some countries where some surveys have been done, unlimited populations, almost none at nationally representative scale, that give you a homogeneous picture of adolescent nutrition. And where those surveys exist, and we've given you just a spattering of some countries in Asia and Africa where those data are, they paint a picture which is indeed quite alarming. They tell us that close to about half of all adolescent girls in some geographies, notably in Africa and Asia, are underweight, and by some definitions wasted if you take a body mass index of under 18.5. They also tell us that when you transit from adolescent to women of reproductive age, there is an overlap area of young girls which are generally ignored. So the data that we have on maternal malnutrition does tell us that it accounts for a significant proportion of the global burden of disease. It contributes perhaps indirectly to about a fifth of all maternal deaths that relate to perhaps micronutrient deficiencies and maternal wasting. And then there are contributions that maternal malnutrition, particularly intergenerational, can make to morbidity. To give you just one example, very few people, I don't know how many people in the audience here are aware of the simple fact that one of the greatest chronic conditions that causes lifelong suffering, obstetric fistulas, are almost 70% concentrated in young women. Those with small pelvises, prolonged labors, and poor access to services. If there was ever a consequence of poor care and adverse maternal nutrition, that is one marker, but it is almost never measured as a consequence of maternal undernutrition. We do have some numerics, and this graph summarizes some of those. So if you look across the world by various UN regions, and I don't know how clear this is from the back, but just humor me by looking at Africa, Asia, and Oceania, you will see that there has been, in general for Africa, as well as other regions, some reduction in maternal wasting. So if you take this category of a BMI less than 18.5, that is representative of acute malnutrition in the context of women, there has been some reduction. In converse, it appears as if obesity has become the dominant issue in the global and regional context. And when these data were compiled last year, this was troubling because it gave an impression that we are perhaps not dealing with deficiency, but perhaps obesity as the emerging issue. We did recognize that the proportion of women with low BMI in some geographies was as high as 10%, and that obesity clearly was, across this age group of women of reproductive age, was beginning to rise. Now, we have now looked at this data in greater detail, and next week the Lancet will publish the data on obesity. And if you look at some of the data, it will be very clear that most of that obesity epidemic is in older age women. And if you look at the younger age, particularly the age that I'm talking about, adolescents, that is where a lot of the wasting is clustered, particularly in Asia and Africa. And therefore, sometimes the averages, summating data across the entire age group of women of reproductive age, gives you the wrong impression. On micronutrient deficiencies, we are grateful to WHO for putting together at least information available from nationally representative data on the prevalence of important deficiencies. And we have, again, data on anemia. When we looked at, Majid Uzati and some of us looked at these data across the globe, we found two starting facts. One, that there hadn't been a major change in prevalence of anemia for both non-pregnant and pregnant women across the world in various geographies over a long period of time, illustrated here on this slide. But the other thing that we discovered, that we could only talk about anemia, that if you really looked at how much information we had for iron deficiency anemia, the representative nature of this data collapsed, and that you were largely extrapolating to indicate that about half of this might be iron deficiency anemia. And that is a sad reflection of how much epidemiological information we have for one of the greatest micronutrient deficiencies in women of reproductive age. We do know that there are other micronutrient deficiencies, and I could give you long lists, but in addition to iron, poor intake of calcium is probably one of the biggest contributors to maternal morbidity, if you take preeclampsia and some of the other consequences into account. We have data on vitamin A deficiency in pregnancy, and it is not a homogeneous picture like this. So I really wanted to show you this data in terms of what we know from some serum retinol measurements. I've actually gone back to some of the source data, and it is a misnomer to paint these countries homogeneously, because these data do not reflect subnational distribution and are in general not reflective of population prevalence for those countries at large, because the samples of women are generally small, with few exceptions. We have data on iodine deficiency, and the point that I'm trying to drive home is that for women of reproductive age, taking the age group that we have right now, in general, we are looking across low and middle income countries at multiple micronutrient deficiencies. These are data from my own country, where we had the occasion to, and the resources to undertake one such survey to look at a range of analytes. And whatever we looked for, we found. And the point to drive home is that women don't have generally iron deficiency anemia alone in the context of poor environments, poor dietary intakes, and multiple pregnancies. They generally are multiple micronutrient deficient, and this has clearly a relationship in terms of what interventions you need to put in place, whether they are dietary, whether they are poverty reduction strategies, family planning, or indeed health sector interventions to address specific deficiencies. One of the more recent contributions, particularly made by the Lancet series, was in trying to understand a little bit of the context of maternal malnutrition, fetal nutrition, and birth outcomes. And this was done as part of this work to address not only maternal wasting, but also micronutrient deficiencies. And we all recognize that there is a clear relationship between some of these indices and the risk of small for gestational age. Now, what do we know about small for gestational age? Sadly, very little. The data that we have available in terms of the association of maternal malnutrition and birth outcomes are largely summarized by some of these trends. Now, these are trends that are available for low birth weight. But how many of you in this audience are aware as to how these data are captured? Now, these are summarized in PowerPoint slides as low birth weight, as if we have measured all of these birth weights. No. In surveys, most of this data is captured by an assessment of relative size at birth. So you ask families and household, was the baby normal at birth, small at birth, or large at birth? And if the family says the baby was small at birth, that's a low birth weight baby. Now that sadly may work in terms of generalization, but in terms of policies and programs, that is pretty much meaningless. And that's been one of the major reasons why this as an issue has been hidden below the public health policy radar screen for a long time. And it is important for us to put implementation and policies in place. If you have an opportunity to read the Every Newborn series in the Lancet that we've just put out last week, you will get a chance to see in the interventions how important it is to have disaggregated interventions to reduce small for gestational age and disaggregated interventions to address prematurity. And both may coexist. What do I mean by this? Here are the data that we have on global prevalence of small for gestational age births. A pretty large number overall, about 32 million babies who are thought to be small for gestational age at birth, about a quarter of all births in low and middle income countries. Now, if you look at the distribution of these births, you will find that the vast majority are term, small for gestational age, but a small proportion are preterm as well as small for gestational age. What we discovered in our analyses across several cohorts was that the risk of mortality, of dying, was disproportionately clustered in the subgroup that is both preterm and small. And they're related to slightly different risk factors in the mother. How large is that risk? If you look at the relative risk of neonatal mortality, across all geographies, if you're preterm and small for gestational age, your risk of dying in the neonatal period is about 30-fold higher on average than if you were appropriate for gestational age. That's a huge proportion, accounting for a large proportion of mortality, and clearly an opportunity for interventions as we outline in our recent publications in the Lancet. Now, I do want to turn to the issue in question. Why does this matter? Why does small for gestational age matter? Now, for some of us who are interested in the DOHAD hypothesis in terms of long-term outcomes, fetal programming under nutrition is clearly a very important issue. But does it have a relationship in the short term beyond mortality? Now, to address this, let's look at the numbers that were thrown this morning in terms of global prevalence of wasting and severe wasting. And I show you this slide again to make the same point that I did to Francesco, that we do have data on severe wasting, but although it's not very clear here, our proportionate information on how much are moderately wasted and overlap with stunting is limited. But we do recognize that the number is pretty large. It is upwards of 50 million. And some of that overlaps very clearly with stunting. Does it have a relationship with fetal growth retardation? How many of these babies are stunted not because that they acquire problems postnatally or they are related to inadequate feeding, but there could very well be fetal factors that are related to this early growth failure. We believe that we have some evidence to indicate that this could indeed be an important contributor. Our overall analysis in the Lancet indicated that the risk of being stunted at 20 months, if you were small for gestational age, could account for about a fifth of all stunting in children under 5. That's a huge number. And that's a number that clearly cannot be tackled postnatally only. And if you try and do that, you would probably have adverse effects in terms of producing obesity later on. The best data that I can give you at population level are again from my own geography. So these are data from Pakistan, from the National Nutrition Survey, where when we looked at the information, we very clearly had stunting peaking by about 24 to 36 months of age. But then the penny dropped that almost half of the stunting was already established by 6 months of age, and that the rest of the stunting was what you acquired. Now, this early onset stunting, we believe, is clearly related to maternal undernutrition. And this could very well be impacted by interventions not just in pregnancy, but more importantly amongst young girls, in adolescent girls and pre-pregnancy, where there has been absolutely no global attention. Can I give you data from other countries suggestive of this? There's some very interesting data emerging from large-scale surveys. And I'll just go up a little north to talk about Afghanistan. Here are data from our recent National Nutrition Survey in Afghanistan, where clearly you see a prevalence of wasting in the south, the conflict-affected areas where there is seasonal and periodic, depending upon access, issues of wasting in childhood. If you look at the distribution of maternal malnutrition as evidenced by relationship to stunting, you find that stunting is in slightly different districts. So if you go back, notice wasting is in the south, stunting is distributed somewhere in the north, but not in the south necessarily. And the penny drops when you look at the prevalence of maternal wasting, and you see it almost overlapping where you see a high prevalence of childhood stunting at that population level. So some of these associations at subnational level of maternal undernutrition and childhood wasting and stunting are just beginning to emerge. Is this important for mortality? Yes, it is. We looked at this as part of our Lancet work in looking at conjoint risks, and fetal growth restriction alone accounts for about 12% of under 5 deaths. When you combine it with various things, including infant and young child feeding, restriction due to suboptimal breastfeeding, micronutrient deficiencies, we go up to about 45% of all deaths related to undernutrition in various dimensions. And these risks, as already alluded to in the opening presentations, are much greater if you are severely stunted, but you will also notice that for moderate stunting, the risk of dying in children under 5 are also about 2-fold higher. And importantly, those risks, if you are wasted, are about 3 to 5-fold higher for both all-cause mortality as well as mortality due to diarrhea and pneumonia. Now let me close by just alluding to some interventions, and I promise not to give you any meta-analyses, but we do have some summary data on what works. And we have that not only from the work in the Lancet, but we have been looking at this over a reasonable range of interventions from various sources that you can look at within the last 4 or 5 years. A lot of this has been published. And if you look at what works, the weakest area, as I pointed out, is interventions across adolescents and women of reproductive age. And this is where a lot of effort needs to go to strengthen our evidence base of interventions. But from what we know, if you were to put some of these interventions together and package them in terms of implementation and delivery, these 4 packages that we talked about in our Lancet series, and look at impact on outcomes, you find that even with the limited information that we have, moderate malnutrition management, as well as prevention through periconceptual and prenatal maternal nutrition interventions, could save a significant proportion of lives, if we could, not just in the neonatal period, but also in early childhood. And the impacts on this in numeric terms, in terms of reduction of stunting and reduction of mortality, both diarrhea and pneumonia specific, is quite significant and quite strong, provided we were able to implement this across the globe. I would do a great disservice if I told you that this was the absolute truth. This is not the absolute truth. The answer to many of the issues around maternal malnutrition, particularly adolescent malnutrition, have to go way beyond the nutrition sector. And they have to do with things that we don't talk about as nutritionists, as people who are public health policy makers. Not only are we cognizant of the low priority given to this area, we don't talk about one of the most important interventions to address maternal survival and maternal nutrition. And that includes things like family planning, addressing the whole issue of maternal depletion in environments where you have hordes of women who are malnourished in young age. Some of that evidence in relationship of maternal malnutrition and maternal wasting, and as well as birth spacing to prevalence of stunting, is available from country studies. These are data from my own country, where if you look at the gap, maternal gap, you will see that this is associated with significantly higher prevalence of stunting in this population. These nutrition blind spots across the life course need to be plugged, and I hope that this particular conference would go a long way in undertaking this. Importantly, we have to address the whole issue of adolescent pregnancies, and particularly unwanted forced pregnancies related to child marriage. You would be amazed as to what proportion of girls are delivering before not only 18 years of age, 15 years of age. Read the recent UNFPA report. In some geographies, that proportion is as high as 20%. And I don't think any nutrition intervention in the world can overcome that if that continues to happen. Let me close, ladies and gentlemen, with just this quotation from Gro Harlem Brundtland, who, as the former director of WHO, made this poignant remark, and I think she hit the nail on the head when she said, "The dual scourge of hunger and malnutrition will be truly vanquished not only when our granaries are full of food, but also when people's basic health needs are met and women and girls are given their rightful role in society." Thank you very much for your attention.
As always, a terrific presentation. Thank you, Dr. Bhutta. Again, because of timing, I think we will go right into our next panel, which you are moderating. We had agreed that for this particular panel, people would sit here rather than getting up and going up and back to the podium. So I will hand over moderation of this session to you.
I'd probably stand. So thank you very much, Eileen, for the opportunity. And how much time do we have altogether? So we have about half an hour. Okay. So can I request our three panelists to identify themselves? Linda Keast from the World Food Programme, Ellen Mulhoff from the Food and Agriculture Organization. Would you like to come to my seat, if you don't mind, just so that we have you closer to the line of vision? Yeah, come here to the top table. I mean, we have two layers here. We have three. There are four people? Okay. So Diane Holland from UNICEF. Diane? Okay, wonderful. And Zita Prinzo from WHO. Hi, Zita. So the topic is largely related to the subject that we have discussed today. And what I would like each one of you to do is to give us a short opening statement on what you think are the major issues in relation to the whole area of maternal nutrition, moderate malnutrition, and then we'll open this up for a discussion both between the panelists, and also I would invite a few interventions from the floor. So can I start with you, Linda?
Yes, thanks. Thanks very much, Professor Bhutta, and thanks for the opportunity to provide some thoughts and some comments about challenges related to the management of moderate acute malnutrition. I think that I'll make a few summary thoughts in terms of what, from my perspective or from WFP's perspective, are some of the key areas. One of the first ones that we think about is around ensuring the availability of nutrient-dense foods for both prevention and treatment. So ensuring that those foods are available in markets or somehow available to households in countries where we're working. A second one is really around increasing the scale of programming. I mentioned yesterday also in my opening remarks about the large proportion of children that don't have access to services for moderate acute malnutrition, either prevention or treatment. And so what are we doing in terms of the scale of programs? But I think also recognizing that it's not just about scale, it's also very much about quality of programs. A third point, I think, is around better harmonization. And so talking again about our role within WFP, focusing on availability and access to nutrients that children need to grow, but also complementing that with health services, with IYCF and other important food security, other important types of complementary interventions. And then I think another key one is, as Dr. Webb and others mentioned this morning, the importance of evidence. And it's not only evidence of what needs to be done, but also more evidence around how we're doing what we're doing and how can we improve some of that. And then the final one, I think, is something that WFP has now really recently started to look at much more, even though we've been looking and working with pregnant and lactating women, but is a collaboration now that we have with UNICEF and UNFPA to look more at nutrition for pregnant and lactating women and also for adolescent girls. So looking again both in terms of the linking kind of what they need in terms of food, but also linking that then to health services and health systems. So those are, I think, kind of the main key challenges that I see moving forward in terms of moderate acute malnutrition. WFP is actively engaged in those, in particular in terms of increasing access to food and basically access to nutrient-dense foods. We've obviously been, as many of you know, involved in the development and improvement of super cereal, of fortified blended foods with the development of Super Cereal Plus. We've also done a lot in the recent years in terms of supply chain management, so pipeline breaks or lack of access to food in many emergencies is always an issue. So we've worked with UNICEF and other NGOs in terms of putting together guidance for specialized nutritious foods. We also now have a forward purchasing facility, and we have mapping of the inventory of specialized foods so we know where they're at, and we also have access so we don't have to wait until there's a crisis, and then there are resources, and then we can actually make an order and begin the shipment process, which often takes many months. But we have actually a facility to have food in storage and rotating through our program so we can be much quicker in terms of response. And in fact, in 2013, 72% of all the children that WFP reached actually had access to these improved foods. And that's both in treatment and prevention. So they weren't receiving the old fortified blended food, but in fact were receiving an improved fortified blended food or a ready-to-use food. So I think in addition to that, we're also, as many of you know, looking a lot more at cash and vouchers, and 30% now of our interventions around food security are through cash and voucher. And so we're looking also at opportunities for how and when and whether cash and vouchers can in fact be used for nutrition. I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done there. We need to make sure that these nutrient-dense foods are available in communities if we're going to use cash and vouchers. But then we also need to think about things like women's role. We don't want to be adding additional work to women. We haven't been able to provide refrigerators or other things. So,
thank you, Linda.
Great, thanks.
Ellen?
Thank you very much. Also, I would like to thank the IAEA very much for having an opportunity to speak at this meeting, and I'm very pleased to share some of FAO's work and experiences. So I think all of you know that our mandate is to raise levels of nutrition and agricultural productivity and to improve standards of living of populations. So by the nature of our mandate, FAO emphasizes food and agriculture as the basis for improving diets and preventing malnutrition. So we are concerned with strengthening the resilience of vulnerable populations through food and agricultural programs and ensuring that such policies and programs can achieve better nutrition outcomes is the main aim of our work. So we do this by raising awareness among policymakers on the benefits of food and dietary diversification. We work with national governments to integrate nutritional objectives into agricultural policies and programs. We strengthen national capacities to empower communities to grow a variety of nutrient-dense foods. And we promote healthy eating through the development of national food-based dietary guidelines and community-based dietary counseling, group cooking sessions, and social mobilization. We also support nutrition training of agricultural and health extension workers and farmers, and we leverage support for scaling up locally appropriate food and nutrition solutions. So I think we all know that eating a good diet is fundamental to health, and optimizing the quality and diversity of foods consumed by all family members is key to achieving positive nutrition programs. We emphasize very much the need for children to have access to nutritious foods in addition to continued breastfeeding to assure their proper growth and developments. And here I would like to underline that appropriate child feeding is essential not only to prevent moderate malnutrition, but it is also vital for treating moderate malnutrition. Children with moderate malnutrition should receive adequate amounts of nutrient-dense foods for sustained recovery and growth. When families learn to eat well and feed their children well, not only will moderate malnutrition be addressed, but it will also be prevented. And here I would like to say that we believe in FAO that there is no one single best way of addressing malnutrition. Countries are increasingly interested in the use of nutrient-rich local foods, including indigenous foods, for preventing and for addressing malnutrition. And depending on the situation and availability and ease of access, local foods may be affordable, acceptable, and potentially more sustainable than other feeding options. The cost of supplying products for treating MAM and SAM, while essential and life-saving during emergencies, can constitute an enormous financial burden on countries' limited budgets in the longer term. And we think that sustainable solutions need to be found. Now, research from Malawi and other countries, some of it is our own, as well as from other researchers, they show that a sizable part of young children's nutrient gap can actually be closed by foods to which families already have access, even though supplementation may be needed to help children meet their full nutrient requirements. However, in many cases, mothers and nutrition workers are not aware of available nutrient-rich foods and need easy-to-use information and practical guidance about the kinds of foods to use, how to prepare and feed them to children, and how to feed a moderately malnourished or sick child. In this respect, we think that efforts are needed to draw attention to the importance of preventing and addressing moderate malnutrition, as well as chronic malnutrition, through locally appropriate solutions and enhanced utilization of locally available food sources. The guidance on different feeding options or combination of options may be needed depending on context. How they can complement and reinforce each other to achieve optimal nutrition outcomes for vulnerable children, families and communities needs to be further explored. And we feel strongly that there is a need for joining up and integrating approaches. There's already been a commentary this morning on the dialogue and the readiness that needs to take place between the emergency and the development communities. We need to break down barriers between these communities, and also we need more evidence and good data from programming on how the different options can be joined up and integrated for the best nutrition outcomes. After all, it is the same child that is being treated and that then needs to be properly fed and cared for at home after he or she has been discharged from the MAM or SAM program. So FAO is interested and ready as an entry point for integrated actions. I think we would like to build locally appropriate and sustainable solutions with other partners to prevent and address malnutrition. In many instances, we work for the same children, families, and communities. So I would like to plead that we all join hands in finding the best possible solutions and a framework for supporting country-level action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So let's move to UNICEF. Diane, UNICEF has a huge responsibility for country-level implementation. Tell us what your take on the morning is.
Well, first of all, Dr. Bhuta, I'm very pleased to be here to speak with you today in a room full of a wide range of experience and expertise, and I'm honored to be able to represent a bit of the work that my colleagues are doing at country level, working in difficult circumstances, to work for our mutual goal of promoting the sustained growth and development of this generation and the next. I'd like to maybe first start off with a few observations that in terms of our language around addressing moderate acute malnutrition, as many of us who have suffered the arm wrestling around common humanitarian funds, sometimes and perhaps too often, we end up posing SAM as life-saving and MAM as not life-saving because the mortality risk is comparatively lower. But I think we need to acknowledge, by the sheer numbers of children that are affected, addressing moderate acute malnutrition is a life-saving act that we do need to take on board together as a community. As has been pointed out as well, we use a range of terminology to describe the different states and forms of malnutrition, but at the same time, we need to acknowledge that these conditions co-occur and that there are implications of these multiple forms of undernutrition on the growth and development of children that need to be taken into account in our programming responses. Where does UNICEF fit into all of this with the great lead-in from Dr. Butta? UNICEF's overall objective in the area of nutrition is to contribute to the realization of children's rights to survival, growth, and development through support to national policies, programs, and research that will increase equitable and sustainable access to nutrition services, and in the end, promote improved nutrition in a context of action by a wide range of actors that are working together to address the underlying causes of malnutrition from the beginning. The range of ways in which UNICEF works, I'll highlight three and a few of the challenges that we see in moving forward. First and foremost, UNICEF has a very special role in contributing to the enabling environment through its advocacy and policy work. Second, through investing in nutrition information systems to better identify our collaborative needs and progress. And to support our country capacity to provide the essential treatment for severe acute malnutrition where it is needed, while mobilizing around prevention activities. I think first and foremost around the enabling environment, we have to acknowledge that we have a responsibility as one of the sister UN agencies to address the shortfalls that are currently faced in providing a continuum of care for acute malnutrition. To that end, we have reinvigorated and continue to build on the foundation that we have together as UN agencies at a global technical level to identify and address critical bottlenecks to country-level action in relation to disconnects and connections that need to be made around policies, tools, and approaches to addressing the range of undernutrition at country level. In the second area of nutrition information, we can say that a lot has been done, that in terms of investments in routine nutrition information systems and in our large-scale assessments, in terms of providing the critical resources to identify where our burdens of undernutrition and to track our progress or lack thereof. At the same time, more needs to be done in improving those national systems and capacity to provide real-time, ongoing monitoring data so that we can really actively address the seasonality of undernutrition and invest more sustainably in the next generation. In addition, the joint estimates of malnutrition generated by WHO, the World Bank, and UNICEF provide a powerful advocacy tool for us to be able to speak with one voice about how we're moving forward. But as has been pointed out, those estimates do have their limitations. They don't take into account edema, they don't take into account incidents, and they aren't necessarily going to give us the answers of how we better estimate our caseloads and design our programs at country level. There's an opportunity for us to move ahead in that area together. Finally, in terms of the country level collaboration, for the most part, UNICEF's support in engaging partners is in relation to providing the safety net of SAM treatment and mobilizing the prevention of undernutrition through micronutrient programming like fortification and supplementation, as well as promotion of infant and young child feeding. The challenge that we face is how best to orchestrate and phase those different interventions so that we are sustainably addressing moderate malnutrition. As UNICEF looks forward, it's also trying to articulate better it's refining its focus on increasing prevention, in particular in areas where acute malnutrition and stunting co-occur, and trying to build on how better UNICEF can leverage work with partners around water and sanitation, early childhood development, and social safety nets, and defining its collaborative role in the resilience agenda, in particular with WFP and FAO, about how we make sustainable improvements in the capacity of individuals and children to respond to nutrition insults and shocks. While UNICEF's role in relation to MAM treatment, as outlined in the MOU in 2011, is primarily related to coordination and facilitation of additional inputs, we do have to acknowledge and in full transparency, acknowledge that there are challenges in the way and our programming approaches to address MAM at this point in time. First of all, in relation to scale and resources. When we are currently faced with an estimated 200,000 children, at least, facing severe acute malnutrition in South Sudan, and multiple factors times that number who are facing moderate acute malnutrition, how can we really mobilize those resources to be able to deliver and reach that many children, even if security and access were not issues? Second, in terms of reach, where we have limited partners on the ground, where where WFP may not be able to formulate partnership agreements, we need to still be able to deliver on moderate acute malnutrition. And while the MOU does allow for UNICEF to take on that role in negotiation with WFP, and it has, for example, in Somalia, there are still perhaps ways that we need to organize ourselves better to deliver. Third, in terms of practicalities, and I think that this really hits home to most of us, when we have different partners and government departments working with different agencies to supply technical guidance and supplies and resources to deliver, and we have that's additional bureaucratic impediments that slow down our ability to be able to address moderate acute malnutrition. When one family or one child have to go from one program to the other simply because they've passed a certain threshold, that may mean huge opportunity costs that mean that families will not choose to continue that type of care. So there are areas that we need to look at in terms of how we are addressing moderate acute malnutrition in these contexts. A few reflections that maybe we can take from UNICEF's work in severe acute malnutrition over the last few years. That we can say in the last 10 years, the use of ready-to-use foods in relation to the treatment of severe acute malnutrition and moderate acute malnutrition have perhaps brought us back to the critical role of adequate nutrients and energy in recovery and growth, which brings us to the essential nature of ensuring adequate infant and young child feeding, in particular complementary feeding, to preventing and managing acute malnutrition. The question, as we move forward, is how to be able to enable families to deliver on that in contexts that are different, in particular food insecure contexts, and what that should look like for us.
Thanks. Ellen, I've got to move on, and maybe Diane, we can come back to this.
I have 10 more seconds. Just 10 seconds.
Go.
Integration of SAM, great. Nutrition, health services, great. Probably not the model for MAM. As we move ahead, there are also gaps in our knowledge. What happens? What is the proportion of MAM that slide into SAM if we don't have any resources to treat them? How do we really promote recovery? Thank you.
Thank you. As you can see, we probably have many of these key questions that will keep coming up and are the crux of the entire nature of the symposium. Let me give the floor to Zita from WHO. WHO has a hugely important normative function, and I would like you to particularly address what role does WHO expect and want to play in terms of leadership in this area.
Thank you, Professor Butta. I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to participate in this panel. WHO has mainly focused on the development of guidance, on policy support to governments, capacity building, and monitoring the global prevalence of the burden. Now, what I'd like to briefly say is just give a brief evolution on the development of guidance and advocacy on MAM. We go back to the year 2006, when there was a consultation, a joint WHO-UNICEF SCN consultation on the community-based management of severe acute malnutrition. In this consultation, the community inpatient and outpatient approaches for SAM were discussed. And following that, in 2007, a joint UN statement was published on the community-based management of SAM. We then realized that it was important to go beyond SAM and to focus on moderate acute malnutrition, to manage moderate acute malnutrition so that we can reduce numbers of children who develop SAM. In 2009, WHO organized a joint WHO, UNICEF, WFP, UNHCR consultation on the management of MAM in children. I'd just like to mention that many of you in the room have been involved in all of this that I'm mentioning now, so thank you to everyone. In that consultation in 2009, proposed nutrient densities for children with MAM were discussed. Thank you, Professor Golden. And issues around anti-nutrients were highlighted. It was already noted at that time that in the context of emerging obesity and non-communicable diseases, the question of promoting diets leading to increased weight gain was not always necessarily satisfactory, depending on what weight gain meant and what does recovery mean. I think Patrick also mentioned that. It was noted that recommended diets needed to promote tissue synthesis and lead to improved functional outcomes, not only weight gain. And there is work that we are planning together with the IAEA on body composition just to look into this. During the consultation, dietary counseling was also looked at, and it was agreed that we needed to move away from a more general, fit-for-all counseling to something that's more locally adapted. In 2010, WHO hosted a second consultation on moderate acute malnutrition, focusing on the programmatic aspects, and this was a huge challenge since there were more questions than answers, and there was a huge research agenda that was set up. Patrick also mentioned that the data is sometimes incomplete to be able to draw conclusions, and many of the solutions are very context-specific. What I'm referring to now is, for example, admission-discharge criteria into programs. Do we look at a blanket approach or a targeted approach for supplementary feeding programs? So it's very difficult for WHO at the global level to come up with general recommendations on these points, since they have to be looked at in the local and context and available resources. In 2012, WHO produced a technical note on the composition, on the proposed composition of supplementary foods for children with moderate acute malnutrition. The note summarized the available evidence, and it also included 10 principles for the nutritional management of children with moderate acute malnutrition. Also in 2012, the World Health Assembly approved the comprehensive implementation plan on maternal, infant and young child nutrition, including the global target on wasting, which Francesco presented. The recommendation in the plan is clearly for a comprehensive approach to reducing malnutrition, including wasting, which means improved access to high-quality foods and to healthcare, promotion of exclusive breastfeeding and improved complementary feeding, improved environmental hygiene to protect against communicable diseases. Now, if we want to reduce the burden of MAM, we have to take it go one step back and really look at prevention, especially improved infant young child feeding and maternal nutrition, as we saw in Professor Butta's presentation. The formulated food supplements are needed in very specific situations. We need to be clear when they're needed, for how long, and how to move over into a more development sustainable approach. The challenge is really to develop sustainable intersectorial approaches that are integrated into national systems. Now, there's a lot packed in there. We need to clearly move to a more child and family focused approach and move away from too rigid silos. The word silos was mentioned in several presentations. The complementarity of the UN agencies is crucial in trying to address this problem, of course together with NGOs and the whole academic partners in the academic field as well. And the aim is, of course, to support governments in high-burden countries to try to reduce the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, my experiment of standing tall and glaring at all the UN agencies to keep to time has been a miserable failure. But we have 10 minutes before we break. We are going to go till 11 o'clock. I would like to open the floor to some short, succinct questions. Indicate to who you are putting this. We'll take about 5 questions, provided they're short. So, sir, identify yourself and to whom you are addressing the question. 1, Zia. 3, 4 at the back. Wilson, 5. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Dr. Sal, coming from Senegal, University of Dakar. Of course, I'm very more comfortable with French, but unfortunately, there is no translation. I will try in English. So I have a comment, short comment, and 1 question.
The question, please, sir. We have only 5 minutes. 5 questions, so if you could ask your question, and we can do the comments in coffee break.
I go direct to the question then. But the comment was very important. I will do it next time. No problem, no problem. The chair said no comment. The question is for Madam Ellen of FAO. What is her opinion on biofortification to address the issue of good nutrition? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So we have a second person up here. Second question.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Julfi. Well, I'm basically asking this question, I think, from donor perspective, but more from the country perspective. We have 5 or 6 countries sitting in this room. Yesterday, David Navarro said, very clearly that, the pressure on the countries to scale up nutrition, and more than 50 countries have joined that movement. Today I hear 3 presentations, excellent presentations, from WHO. Francisco, you talked about the global scenario. Then, Patrick, you come in and you talk about, the evidence and how the evidence is lacking by quality. Yeah? We need more quality evidence. So it's a big challenge. Then Julfi comes in and he talks about, the huge data gap. Maternal nutrition is very important, but how little we know about it. So what message, like if we are having, say, 5 finance ministers are sitting in this room and some donors, what message we are relaying to these people? So if I have a tough decision to make on resources, and what you guys are saying, the missing link, and for how long we have to deal with it, while we hear from UNICEF, from WFP, from WHO, that they have huge focus on information, building evidence, and we've been hearing about this gap. So can we talk about some sort of time frame, by when we will not talk about this evidence gap, but we'll talk about the governments to, say, do something and scale up nutrition.
Thank you, Zia. We have to plug the gap. 2 questions.
My name is Bridget Idam with World Vision International. And this is related to, my question or comments is related to monitoring and evaluation. I think yesterday when David Nabarro was speaking, he mentioned the fact that the SAN has a common results framework. They have intervention package that they are implementing. Today when Patrick talked, he talked about the need for evidence, quality evidence, and the lack thereof. And as much as we would have effectiveness trials that would be implemented, this will always be a small number compared to programs that are implemented. But I think there is a need for us to, in the program implementation, to have standard guidance as to what is it that we are measuring, the indicators that we are measuring, the intervention delivery, and also monitoring the evidence, to help build up the evidence of the implementation that we are actually delivering. And so I'm calling, it's a call to UN organizations, the donor organizations, other governments, to work together, and NGOs to work together to build up monitoring systems, databases, stuff like that will help us build the evidence, and also use innovations like mobile health and so on to kind of reduce the load.
Thank you. So I hope there was a question in there, but there isn't. So we go to the back. Go ahead.
Thanks very much. A couple of speakers, sorry, my name's Andy Seal from University College London. A couple of speakers mentioned the problems or challenges with the lack of integration of the approach to MAM due to the split mandate between WFP and UNICEF. I just wondered, they also spoke about steps that have been taken to improve that integration. So I just wondered, do Linda and Diane have a vision for what that's going to look like, and is there a roadmap to get there? Thanks.
Great question. So please note that last question.
I'm Wilson Were from WHO. My question goes to Patrick. Looking at what you presented in terms of evidence, you mainly came up with saying that food supplements work in MAM and SAM. I'm already seeing bias. How about, like FAO was saying, looking at the evidence around food security, having populations get the right food to actually feed, as versus to what we are calling food supplements, in a view of the fact that MAM is something which is going to happen in the communities, probably which might not even reach the food supplement level. What evidence do we have behind that? Thank you.
Great. So we have 3 questions that relate to FAO, UNICEF, and WFP partnerships. So can I request that they be taken first, and then I'll pass the baton to Patrick and Francesco to answer the question that Zia posed. Please go ahead.
I'll just briefly answer the question on biofortification. Just to say FAO supports biofortification, and we consider it not as a magic bullet, but one additional tool to address micronutrient deficiencies and malnutrition that we have in our toolbox. Indeed, I think all the approaches that we have been talking about this morning are of extreme importance. However, they need to be targeted appropriately and contextualized to the specific issues and problems that we are facing. But I think all the approaches, improving food security, promoting infant and young child feeding, family planning, a very important issue having been mentioned as well, hygiene, water, health and sanitation, treating malnutrition, all these are important and need to work in unison with each other, and appropriate combinations of these and options of how they can be integrated need to be looked at more seriously. I don't think this has been done sufficiently, but I think there are opportunities to do so.
UNICEF? Dan?
Well, maybe I'll start and then invite Linda to complement. Around the relationship between MAM and SAM programming, I think that WFP just recently finalized its mapping of MAM programming globally, which complements the several rounds of mapping that UNICEF has worked with partners in mapping SAM programming. This is our strategic moment to sit down and be able to say, what does that mean together? Where are we at country level, at subnational level, and what should those working relationships look like? This is also a critical time when we're trying to also be a bit more systematic about looking at where our partnership has worked well, and say, for example, in response to the refugees from Mali and Niger, where there was quite a lot of collaboration around joint assessments and planning and delivery of programming for nutrition, and trying to more systematically identify those and translate those into our policy and programming guidance. And I think at a very practical level as well, limited by time and capacity, I think that we've also made efforts to try to harmonize our approaches around the products themselves and some of our food safety guidelines around them through and I'll hand it over to Linda.
I don't have too much to add to that. I think we're also looking a bit more at harmonizing programs, harmonizing products, and exploring a little whether or not we could use one product for both SAM and MAM, and that might facilitate some of the work. But I also think that when we talk about integration of MAM and SAM, I think we have to think more carefully about where it might be integrated and where it might not be integrated, because there might be situations where it doesn't. We don't see a purpose of really institutionalizing MAM treatment. And so I think that's where we'll hopefully use the mapping to kind of look at and the lessons learning across countries to see where the investment really was necessary to integrate and where we don't. And again, I think I mentioned yesterday it's an evolving issue. The more and more that prevention programs are at scale and working well in countries, then I think how we work with MAM and STEM will also be different, because if the prevention is there, then the treatment might be, for MAM particularly, might be less relevant, or how we'll manage it. So I think we're looking at interim strategies, but then also looking more long-term as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Francesco and Patrick, I mean, Zia threw us in the cricket parlance, a bouncer to ask us, what do we need to do if we are saying that there is just no data or poor data? Let me start by just answering that the good is probably as good without you pursuing the best all the time. And I think there is nothing to stop us from moving into settings where you can implement what seem to be plausible things, while you collect the information and the necessary data that you need to plug the gaps at the same time. But I'll pass this to Patrick and to Francesco to perhaps answer this.
Yeah, I mean, WHO has been working quite a lot on as you know, on putting the evidence in place and developing guidelines and communicating the guidance. The last 4 years we've been producing over 25 new guidelines. So we're pretty much on track on this. There's a few areas where there's more work done, like the lipid-based supplements, and we're sort of catching up with that. But we're there. So in terms of what is evidence-based, it's clear. We also have a platform to disseminate. Go to the Library of Evidence of Nutrition Actions. Clearly said, we're trying to make it easier to assemble in terms of information. So I don't think the problem is what to say. But at the same time, acknowledge there could be plausible new interventions, but use a portfolio approach. So don't scale up what is sort of still under investigation. Scale up what is there, what we know, how to deliver, and then maybe just use a little bit of money to then also go for the newer intervention. That will help us finishing the work. Actually, I'd like to say something on a colleague of World Vision, which is really important, implementation tracking. We need to know how much we are reaching the population, so coverage, geographical coverage, but really, hypothetically, even the quality of the delivery of services. We're trying to do some work to make that, available. I mean, we have a global database on the implementation of nutrition action with over 1,000 policy documents, over 2,500 reports. You can actually submit your own reports in that system. UNICEF is doing a great job with dashboards. So I think we are more and more moving into an era of understanding where programs and policies are delivered. We need to have an agreement, and hopefully we'll do that, on what are the key elements of this implementation tracking, so that we can decide better how to allocate resources. Because we need to move resources where the gaps in implementation are.
Patrick, you get the final word.
Thanks. I don't want to be remembered as having been the one to say we have nothing. That's not true. We have a lot. But we have to build on it and we have to improve it. And most importantly, there's a lot more evidence on its way. There are something like 70 plus studies ongoing or planned that deal with various aspects of this space. So in the coming 5 years, we're going to have a lot more information feeding into this kind of dialogue. But let's ensure that it is appropriately presented so that it is not, 5 years from now, classified as low quality or unclear risk of bias. We need to assess how our studies are assessed and then respond appropriately to ensure that the evidence is complete and appropriate. Some of these studies are on alternatives to food. There's cash and voucher programs being considered. Some include local foods, not just so-called industrial foods imported. But very few are focused on prevention of MAM or addressing mild conditions and progression. We do need to look at these cohort studies to try and tease out what we can assess in terms of stunting and growth over time, but we have to do better. I do totally agree that governments and NGOs have a major role in better documenting what they're doing, not just what they're doing, but how they're doing it. And M&E systems still all too often suffer from a focus on inputs and delivery, the supply side, supply of inputs, services, and so on, and much less on coverage, on uptake, actual adoption rates, and impacts among subgroups. So, and a lot of the problem resides in what governments and donors require from those programs as evidence, and I think that is an area we need to look at and tighten up as well. Thanks.
Thank you. So my duty is now to hand over for some logistic agreements, and you tell us how we caffeinate ourselves.
Hopefully it's right outside. Is that right, Lola? But we will have our coffee break, a little bit shorter than expected, and we'll reconvene here for the final part of this session at 11:20. Thank you.
We can go down there. Yeah, sure.
Oh, no, stay here.
Thank you.
to the conference room.
if I could ask people to take their seats, and people near the doors, if you could try to shuttle individuals in who are still having coffee. Just a little bit on logistics, obviously. So a little bit on logistics. We are reconvening with three panelists representing different countries. This particular session, including an open-ended Q&A, will end at 12:20. We will then have lunch. It'll be a truncated lunch, and we'll be back here at 1:30 for the beginning of session 2. For questions, I had some feedback that some people would prefer to have questions submitted in writing, and that's fine with me. If you prefer to do that, have your questions in writing, I know I introduced Jeremy and Rebecca earlier. Do you want to raise your hand? They will take your written questions, and I will, if I find there are some similar themes coming up over and over again, I'll try to nest the questions in groups so that it doesn't get repetitive. So you can ask questions either at the microphone, or you can submit them in writing to either of the rapporteurs. So we're looking forward to a lively session. I am going to introduce each of our three speakers now. I think it'll run smoother to go into the panel discussion. And as you probably have ascertained, the names that are in your program are not the names of the individuals who are representing countries here. And I have to say, thank you, because we didn't give panelists a lot of notice, but they've been so generous with their time. And with that, I'd like to first introduce Obe Asiri, who is from Tanzania, is the Director of Coordination of Government Business in the Office of the Prime Minister of Tanzania, and also serves as the Sun Country focal point. Obe will go first. Second is Mir Mubarak Hussein, who is Deputy Program Manager of National Nutrition Services, Institute of Public Health in Bangladesh. And our third speaker is Hadi Shanum, who is with the Ministry of Health, the Zero Hunger Plan in Guatemala. And with that, each of our presenters will have 5 minutes focusing on their specific country experience in prevention and treatment of MAM. And then the major portion of this particular session, this particular panel, will be devoted to questions and answers. And with that, if I may turn it over to Obe.
Thank you very much. Let me very quickly give an overview of what has been happening in Tanzania in terms of management of acute malnutrition. But generally, in overall, acute malnutrition in Tanzania has been low as compared to chronic malnutrition. The data we have shows us that moderate acute malnutrition stands at 3.6%, according to Demographic Health Survey of 2010, as compared to stunting, for example, which stands at 42%. And the management of this acute malnutrition has evolved over time. In the past, during 1960s and 70s, there were two main approaches which were used. The one was the nutrition rehabilitation units, in which residential units were attached in the health facilities with nutrition gardens, nutrition education, and cooking demonstration, and so forth. So this was really facility-based. But at time we saw that was not working, because what happened after you have managed or treated the child, that was not sustainable. We turned it into community-based nutrition rehabilitations in 1970s, in 1980s, which really entails rehabilitation of child at home using resources available in the community. And that one worked somehow, not very well, but it really helped us to put this into community. But since in 2006, with the recommendation from WHO and UNICEF, we adopted the integrated management of acute nutrition. And under this integrated fashion, identified malnourished children are categorized as moderate malnourished or severe malnourished, with medical complication or without complications. Then, this categorization determines management approach. And those with medical complications are admitted in health facilities for proper feeding and treatment of life-threatening conditions. And then when they get better, they are released to go home. There is also dietary treatment, which consists of the therapeutic milk for stabilization, transition, and rehabilitation phases, and ready-to-use therapeutic foods. And there is also the treatment of dehydration in children with severely acute malnutrition. And within this integrated approach, a number of things have been done. One, tools have been developed, including guidelines, training manuals, job aid, and strategic and scale-up plan for management of acute malnutrition have also been developed. Facilities, staff have been trained, and due to this, good recovery rates are noted in some facilities, especially those ones who are doing very well and with good staff. And today, some facilities are procuring local ingredients and preparing their own therapeutic milk. So this is an advancement to contextualize the issue and localize and taking an advantage of available foods in the community, which to me is important as it's more sustainable. And we have formed the National Consultative Group of Management of Acute Malnutrition that meets biannually. So in general, we can say there are some recorded success as the moderate acute malnutrition remain low, but challenges remain. You know, we have staffing problem in terms of adequacy and quality of them. There is high attrition. And reaching peripheral facilities remain a problem because this is a problem in most of the African countries due to infrastructural bottleneck. But most people do not prefer to work at peripherals where there are a lot of limitations to attract the staff there. And supplies and equipment still a challenge, though really it's been tried to do at that level. And the most critical one is scaling up to reach everywhere. It is still not really covered every facility in the country. Those are challenges, but as I said, there are some success. It remained very low, below 5%, which we are talking, and more needs to be done in terms of integrating the chronic and acute malnutrition. As we see, they are really related. Working in isolation is not the best option. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Now we'll move on to Mir.
Thank you very much. Good morning and assalamu alaikum. I would like to start by thanking the IAEA for giving me the opportunity to describe the nutrition status of Bangladesh to you at this important meeting. You know, Bangladesh is a very big country in terms of its population, which is 160 million, and every year 3 million babies are born. We have approximately 15 million under 5 children and 6 million under 2s. Annualized data 2012 data shows that the severe acute malnutrition in Bangladesh, the number is 300,000 and MAM number is 1.35 million. We know from the Lancet data 2013, the aggregate results of death, under 5 death, 45% comes from undernutrition, which comprises the fetal growth restriction, stunting, wasting, and deficiencies of vitamin A and zinc, along with suboptimal breastfeeding. In Bangladesh, anthropometry has improved considerably. In the first 13 years, stunting has reduced from 64% in 1999 to 38% in 2012. And underweight has fallen from 54% to 34% in the same period. MAM also fallen from 13% in 1992 to 9% in 2012. Same from 3% to 2% in the same year. With this background in mind, there has been a major changes in the programmatic approach to nutrition in Bangladesh. Prior to 2011, the National Nutrition Program catered to only one-third of the population and was run by NGOs working under government stewardship. After 2011, the nutrition program has been mainstreamed and is now directly run by government workers and is called the National Nutrition Services. A key feature of the National Nutrition Services is the multi-sectoral approach where 13 ministries of the government of Bangladesh now own and supervise the activities of this operation plan. The operation plan has 20 components, significant amount which are vitamin A supplementation, so National Vitamin A Plus campaign, albendazole distribution among children, iron and folic acid distribution among mothers, iodization of salt, vitamin A fortification in oil, and the management of acute malnutrition and infant and young child feeding. Under the management of acute malnutrition, we have developed national guidelines for the facility management of SAM in 2008 and which has been revised in 2012. National guidelines have been also been developed for CMAM in 2011. For facility-based management of SAM, we have thus far trained personnel at 100 primary, secondary and tertiary centers across the country, which are now fully functional. By the end of 2014, we will have trained personnel from a further 100 primary, secondary centers. This leaves us with a further 373 centers to train in the coming 2 years up to 2016. All these capacitized facilities each have 2 to 4 beds allocated for the treatment of children with SAM. Our SAM program currently consists of committee-based activities, committee-based management of SAM, and committee-based management of MAM. Under this program, we have started by training 4,500 frontline health workers from 50 sub-districts. This leaves 67,800 personnel from the remaining 436 sub-districts to be trained in the next 2 years. These trained workers are now working under a new government order where the measure MUAC in 6 to 59-month-old children at EPI promotion session at home. Some children with a MUAC less than 11.5 centimeters are sent directly to the primary healthcare hospitals for assessment by a doctor. Their children with SAM with complication are treated in the facility, whereas children with SAM without complication are treated at home with home-cooked energy-dense foods. MAM children with a MUAC of 11.5 to less than 12.5 centimeters are sent to community clinic where anthropometry and BCC are done, and these children are treated at home with cooked energy-dense food. Our nationally recommended home-cooked energy-dense food are based on recipes developed at the ICDDRB and are called khichuri and halwa. The first khichuri is the traditional savory dish cooked with rice, lentils, vegetables and oils, providing 145 kilocalorie per 100 gram of the food. The second halwa is the traditional sweet food cooked from wheat flour, lentils, oils and molasses, providing 240 kilocalorie per 100 gram of the food. We have in place weekly monitoring and a monthly reporting system at community clinics and Upazila health complexes, and the first data are now shared starting to be generated from this system. It is clearly too early to provide any initial results from the program, but we anticipate a number of key challenges to the CMAM program in Bangladesh. I would like to end this now by describing these challenges so that the deliberation of coming few days of this meeting can inform us with possible solutions which can take back us to the strengthen our program. The first challenges will be the large number of workers to be trained, then there are the issues surrounding supervision and monitoring of field activities. The third challenges will be regarding to logistics supply and management. Fourthly, the integration of IYCF and CMAN programs. And last but not least, demand creation in the community. I leave you these thoughts and look forward to your valuable inputs in this meeting. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
And now Heidi.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Heidi Sunum. I have the honor to present to you the experience and challenges in the managing of moderate acute malnutrition in Guatemala. First, we are working in the food and nutrition security. In Guatemala, food and nutrition security is the right for every person to have secure, economical, and social access in a sustained and timely way to adequate food both in quantity and quality, preferably of national origin, with cultural relevance and proper biologic utilization of maintain a healthy and active life. That is, in the National Food and Nutrition Security Policy was issued in 2005, and the National Food and Nutritional Security Law is in the Decree 32/2005. The regulation of the law was issued in the Government Decree 75/2006. Actually, we are working in the Plan of Zero Hunger Pact in the concept of food and nutrition security. The purpose and objectives of the Plan of Zero Hunger Pact to address chronic hunger and mitigate seasonal hunger, to reduce in 10% the prevalence of chronic child malnutrition by the end of the 2015, by promoting early child development, to prevent seasonal hunger and reduce acute malnutrition mortality in children under 5 years, to promote food and nutrition security as the basis of the comprehensive development of the entire Guatemalan population. The Zero Hunger Pact plan is formulated from a program to reduce malnutrition chronic and the scaling of nutrition zone and the 100 days windows. We are working in the delivery of basic service in health and nutrition, promotion of breakfast and complementary food, education in food and nutrition, fortified food, assistance to population vulnerable due to food insecurity, improvements of common and family income, water and sanitation, local governance in food and nutrition security, healthy schools, healthy households. We are working in many actions targeted to fight acute malnutrition with health care guidance, nutrition surveillance, food and nutrition education in nutrient care. To prevent acute malnutrition, the Ministry of Health has implemented standards and protocols that aim to establish the technical and standard guidance for the early treatment and recovery of children with acute malnutrition. In the Ministry of Health norms, we have integral health care guidelines for the primary and secondary level, protocol for the ambulatory treatment of children with acute malnutrition, protocol for the hospital care of children with acute malnutrition, and care protocol for nutrition and recuperation centers. So, also we working in survival of malnutrition morbidity and mortality. With these years have a protocol for the survival of malnutrition morbidity and mortality, establishment of a round table for the analysis of morbidity and mortality caused by malnutrition at the central and local level. We working in active and passive case identification in coordination with Food and Nutrition Secretary. Treatment with local food, treatment with ready-to-use food, routes. Also we're working in action for food and nutrition education with counseling session, personalized counseling at health service, and home visits. We're working with governance in food and nutrition security, creation of support networks and community-level involvement, and activation of nutritional emergency plans. Thank you very much.
I think we will have several rounds of questions, and if we may, let's start with questions that are directed first to our country representatives. We'll have a series of questions, have responses, and then we'll move on to the broader set of presenters from this morning. And again, if you could indicate your name and organization when you ask a question from the floor. Please.
Thank you, panelists. I'm Albert Lure from Ministry of Health, Uganda. My concern, particularly, might be occurring from the earlier presentations. All along, it has been given that we are expressing stunting for the below 5 years. Could we get a clear cutoff where we'll be expressing stunting? Is it from 659 or 1 to 59? Otherwise, if you are just mentioning below 5 years, it makes us go up to 0 days on the days of delivery of that baby. So I feel it to be a misrepresentation to indicate that somebody of about maybe 6 weeks is stunted. We'd rather use weight for age for that purpose. And that one also calls me to draw the attention on how best we can do the growth monitoring, particularly in our settings in Africa. If you at least we are doing growth promotion and monitoring, where periodical at month intervals, we come up and weigh these children or these babies, particularly at community level, it could be a better time for us to make an intervention in terms of health and other interventions that are desirable. That also gives me to our partners. As we focus on acute malnutrition, I feel, or it is known many times, the immediate causes. If you are looking at putting availability of food at table, but not focusing at the conditions surrounding the health of the individual, it is far-fetched in that a child has all, whatever age it would be, to eat. Just within 1 or 2 days, if it falls ill, it may not be able, rather it will slide into acute malnutrition. Therefore, what could we do? Could we get a refocus on how best we can involve health interventions, such as immunization for those immunizable preventable diseases, community participation in preventing ill health, like involving the community leaders or other players at community level, who can promote, for instance, breastfeeding. I'll look at also promotion of immunization, promotion of pneumonia using the community approach, and maybe diarrhea. There are packages which have been supposed, for instance, in integrated community case management. Could we adopt those as a by the way to make mitigations for the health of these children as we avail more food at table? I hope it is one of the ways to move in order for us to avert acute malnutrition occurrence.
Thank you. A number of different questions nested there, but thank you. And the lady in the blue third.
Hello, I'm Jacqueline Fries, working for Save the Children, an international NGO. My question I would like to ask Heidi. Please, you've described a wide range of interventions that are going on in Guatemala in the strategy. Are you able to tell us which of these interventions are able to prevent moderate acute malnutrition, please?
Thanks so much. I would like to just ask...
Could you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Noel Zagre. I am from UNICEF, based in Nairobi. So, on successful and challenges with regard to MAM treatment and programs, I would like to ask to the panelists what was the size of the programs that they have been running, and to what extent program control, program management itself, even in terms of logistics, in terms of to what extent do we know enough about our program, to what extent do we have control on our program, to be able to adjust the program as we proceed, has also affected the result. Thank you.
And I'm sorry, I don't know people's names, but please.
Fatima Dibi from Casablanca, Morocco. My question is about the engagement of universities facing this crisis. And I would like to share our experience in Casablanca about this. We had developed and engaged medical education, acting on interdependency in learning and transformative learning. As in Tanzania, we have also the IMCI strategy with its 3 components, clinical and community components, and we used the community components of IMCI to introduce some concepts as the empowerment, community participation, and partnerships. As model, we use nutrition. So we have more than 300 students who leave the outpatient care structure to inhabitants. I am French speaking, so I do my best to explain in English. So we can cover a large population using students, medical students. We associate training with research action in the field. So we can assure a large coverture for nutrition education, for managing malnutrition, moderate malnutrition in outpatient care structures. How about your experience about this?
Thank you. Let's answer some of this, and I'm going to exercise the prerogative of the chair and ask Dr. Bhuta, if he would, to take on the first question from our Ghanaian colleague about measurement of stunting timing.
So, I mean, I'm not the definitive repository of information on this, but here is basically what I think is emerging from some of the recent evidence. Firstly, we are beginning to recognize that linear growth retardation is also evident at the time of birth. So in our measures of small gestational age, being stunted at birth is an important attribute which is not measured. Now, having said that, it's going to be very challenging to measure it at scale. So maybe some effort needs to be put in place to look at proxy markers. But as I mentioned, it's very clear that that's an important marker of early deviation. So whether it's 20%, 30%, or how much of early stunting is related to this is not very clear. The second is this whole issue of how children move in and out of moderate malnutrition and can even recover from short periods of stunting. So if you look at patterns of stunting from recent cohorts, of which there are at least 3 that people have looked at recently, it appears that there are 3 different patterns of linear growth retardation. Some of this is apparent in Africa, some of this is apparent in other places. So one is where you are beginning to get a fairly steady early deviation which kind of stays, and then even if you recover, you stay below 2 standard deviations or thereabouts. There's another subgroup where we believe enteropathy may be playing a role, where they just continue to deviate and may not necessarily have overt high burden of diarrhea or other diseases, but can clearly have some form of enteropathy where there is linear growth retardation, not easily explained by nutrient intake alone. And then there is a mixed group where you have periods of decelerations and recovery, but not sufficient enough. So it's important to, in my opinion, to get a sense of these patterns of early linear growth retardation in the subset of children where stunting is a marker to get a better sense of what is happening. But even more importantly, as we discussed this morning, this interface of how many of these children actually also have evidence of wasting, both moderate and severe, which overlaps or doesn't with stunting, is a very important public health question that has not been addressed. In our Lancet work almost a decade ago and even recently now, we have stuck our neck out to say if stunting does not generally overlap with severe wasting. And that is true, that if you take the category of children who are severely wasted and you look at stunting in general, there isn't an overlap necessarily. But the overlap, when you moment you move to moderate wasting, is huge. And that's what I mentioned this morning as being the policy confusion around how do you address these two different issues or two different functional markers of linear growth retardation and wasting in a meaningful way within programs. Patrick, do you have any thoughts on this?
That was perfect.
There was a question about the need to focus on underlying causes of MAM. Do any of the panelists want to tackle that one? Mir?
Of course, it is need to address the underlying causes. Most of them, the causes are immunization, lack of immunization, and the IUICF activities, lack of IUICF activities. In Bangladesh, we have experience about the last few years, the IUICF activities is stuck on 43 to 45%. And so it is very need to address the IUICF immunization and other supplementation program. Thank you.
There was a specific question, Heidi, about, from your experience in Guatemala, which intervention or combination of interventions seem to be most effective in preventing MAM?
Thank you. We need translation. Thank you. En Guatemala estamos trabajando, como lo decía, con el plan del Pacto Hambre Cero. Thank you.
If I may, thank you. In Guatemala, we are working with Zero Hunger Pact,
donde estamos con la Ley de Seguridad Alimentaria y Nutricional,
with the Food and Security Law,
y en conjunto con Scaling Up Nutrition,
and with the Sun Initiative,
donde estamos brindando las siguientes intervenciones.
These are the following interventions we are undertaking.
La promoción de la lactancia materna exclusiva,
breastfeeding,
la promoción de alimentación complementaria a partir de los 6 meses,
promotion of complementary feeding from 6 months,
la higiene con énfasis en lavado de manos,
hygiene, particularly hand washing.
Trabajamos también con inmunizaciones,
immunizations.
También estamos trabajando con desparasitación en los niños.
Parasite prevention. Treatment.
Provisión de micronutrientes.
Micronutrients provision.
Y vitamina A.
And vitamin A.
También trabajamos a nivel comunitario para el tratamiento de la nutrición aguda.
Also at the community level with for the treatment of acute malnutrition.
Con alimentos locales.
With local foods.
Y tratamiento con la nutrición severa con alimentos listos para consumir.
And severe malnutrition with ready-to-use foods.
Lo más importante es el trabajo que se hace en educación alimentaria y nutricional a todas las familias.
Most importantly is the work in education in food and security for the families at the local.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. There was a question from our UNICEF colleague about the size of programs, scale of programs.
Thank you very much. I don't want to attempt that. My colleague Ellen Sem will do that tomorrow in the panel. But what I want to say generally, the programs which have some time-limited timelines and which are most of the time donor funded, are not sustainable. So what we are trying to say is to integrate all these activities in the national plans, in the district plan, decentralize them so that they become, activities which are budgeted for and for, which becomes more sustainable and the continuity is assured rather than concentrating on the programmatic issues with the timeline, and when the donor money goes, the program also dies naturally. Thank you.
Mira or Heidi, do you want to respond to that? Size of program?
It is very difficult to say the size of program, what is the size of program or what would be. But it is, in our country, we have 20 components of nutrition program. We address the total community of our country. But it is, we have another program of IMCI, we have another maternal nutrition program also. But it is actually should address the community of the country. It should be. Thank you.
And the last question in that round, Saskia was asking about the use of students to cover a larger population, and have there been experiences in your countries with that? Using students as a vehicle for covering a larger percent of the population?
So I'll translate. Estudiantes que ayudan de extensión en los programas para aumentar la cobertura. I've just translated for her that.
Please.
Please. Bueno, en Guatemala sí tenemos un programa de extensión de cobertura.
In Guatemala we do have an extension of coverage program.
Donde las personas que no llegan al centro de salud o al servicio de salud,
where people that cannot go to the health service,
el servidor público llega a la comunidad, a los hogares para brindar todos los servicios de atención en nutrición y salud.
The health person goes to the household, at the household level, to provide health service.
Thank you. All right. For this next round of questions, I'm going to open it up to the entire group of participants from this morning. So obviously more questions at the country level, fine, but also the UN panel and then our speakers earlier this morning.
So Mike had a question from before.
Oh, please. Well, Kay, let's go with Kay first and then Michael.
Thank you very much. I wanted to make a comment on Patrick's presentation. He mentioned heterogeneity in the results of systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And the sources of heterogeneity that he listed were primarily methodological, and that this was preventing pooling of data. But I'd like to point out that there's also heterogeneity due to biological differences and context-specific differences, which result in heterogeneity in the ability to respond to these interventions. And in my opinion, it is a mistake to pool those together in a meta-analysis, because you then do not learn from which situations something works and in what situations it does not work. So I think it's important for the community, both the research community and programmatic, to continue to look at individual projects and studies to understand better the reasons for that heterogeneity. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael?
In terms of the implementation, which I thought this mini session was about, I would like to ask the panelists if they've looked at the negative effects of a MAM program. In most countries I work in and have been to, there's a very limited health budget. There are very weak health services. And if you suddenly put 100 children with MAM into a health centre, and ask the staff to look after them, they love it because they've got something to give to the children and to the mothers. But potentially it has a detrimental effect on all the other programs which those staff have to do, like immunization, maternal child health, IMCI, and so on. And by imposing a MAM program on a health service, I want to know the detrimental effects of that program on the provision of health services to the children. I'm particularly concerned when you include pregnant and lactating women in MAM programs for getting supplements, because they have to walk to get their supplement. They might then have to walk back again for maternal child health, for antenatal care, and they don't walk for the antenatal care, and we may be having a major detrimental effect on pregnancy and the management of pregnancy because we are asking pregnant women to walk a second time to pick up a little supplement just because they have a low MUAC. And in my opinion, the pregnant woman should be managed, high-risk pregnancies, and should be managed entirely by the obstetric staff and not by other staff. So it's really about the people that are doing these programs. Do they examine, do they look at the negative effects of the program on the overall provision of health services and maternal health services? Thank you.
Thank you. Woman over here.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Wright from Glasgow in the UK. I'm an academic, a paediatrician. Most of my points have already been taken by Kay and Michael, because I think the key things that are coming out of this are the heterogeneity, the difference. There isn't one condition called MAM, but I am very concerned about potential harms, and I think Michael's point is really well made, and I haven't thought of it. My concern is about displacement by supplementary foods. There's displacement of family foods, the disruption of the normal weaning process, the normal feeding development of a child. And we've seen a great deal of this happening in the developed world with the overuse of supplementary high-energy drinks and tube feeding. But you can see evidence of this in studies that have looked at MAM, where vast amounts of energy have been given to children and tiny gains result. And if it's a small gain, then there's a huge displacement of food going on. And that could have major detrimental effects after the programme stops.
Thank you.
Josephine Ipe, Global Nutrition Cluster Coordinator. Two questions. One is in relation to the discussions we had in the morning about issues relating to data availability and the gaps that have been established. Similarly, I think from the field perspective, we really face in the management of MAM in emergencies with a situation where there are influx of all types of products, and the regulation around that is really missing. So my question is, who then takes a leadership role in ensuring that the data is systematically gathered so that we are able to inform decision and policies and guidance to help us at country level, much as, whether it's with the UN agencies or the academic institutions, we all agree these are the gaps. So who is going to take the leadership role to ensure that that gap is filled? The second question I have is in relation to MAM management in non-emergency contexts. I appreciate the presentation made by the three countries. I think they are very clear in terms of what roadmap the countries are taking in ensuring there's policy, there's this, there's that, and also very clear in terms of management of SAM, ensuring that it's systematically, in the health facilities, but also at community level. But for MAM, in the regular program, Bangladesh, they say they have 1.3 million. And how on earth are you going to manage the food supplies and all that? And you did say that your response, all the three countries, also included food supplement. How do you decide which districts? Is it seasonally? Is it during this hunger gap season where we really feel something needs to happen? How are those kind of decisions made by countries? Especially when you talk of sustainability. We are not talking of emergency program here where you run in, provide food and you get out. No, we are talking of systems that can be there to provide service for these children. And I didn't get it from any one of the presenters. How do you make that kind of decisions? Thank you.
Thank you. Last question in this round.
Thank you. I'm Helen Semu from the Ministry of Health, Tanzania. Listening to Patrick's presentation this morning and the presentation from UN agencies, and I'm looking for the take-home message to my minister, for example. As you are moving forward for concrete evidence, currently in Tanzania we have included therapeutic supplementary foods into our essential drug list. We are struggling financially to accommodate or to provide those commodities. The ministry or the government has never been able to purchase, but the support has been through the partners. And on and off partners are withdrawing. For example, supplementary food, it's a number of years now we have not got support around that area. But already at the community level, we have created demand. What would I advise the Minister for Health with all this progress which you have made while we don't have concrete evidence? Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Patrick, I don't know whether you want to comment on Kay Dewey's comment about heterogeneity.
Well, not just Kay's, but I totally agree with Kay. You're absolutely right. In the interest of time, that was another slide that I cut. There's so many of the systematic reviews point to the contextual specificity and the need for more information, more transparent information on context of studies. Both of those are essential, and I completely agree. And just to take both Mike's comment and yours, I think the one take-home message is that we do have evidence that a variety of products are efficacious and effective in certain circumstances. The products where we don't have much evidence is how to build up the capacity, the institutional and human capacity that is required to effectively reach coverage and quality of service delivery in a cost-effective way, whether it's in development or a program that is brought in to respond to emergency or to address conditions in development. That's really where more of the evidence is lacking. There is a flip side, Mike, to your point, which is a very, very real point and one we need to address. But in similar countries that I've been in, I've actually heard the opposite stated as well, which is nobody came to take up our facilities and our services because they were considered to be too poor or too weak or whatever. And once we started these programs, people came for those programs but kept on coming for the other services as well. And now we're fully busy with doing everything, whereas before we were only 10% employed. So I think we do need to look at this question from both angles and take it very seriously.
And then there were two related questions, Michael and the woman, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, from UK, about the issue of negative effects of supplemental feeding, and is there evidence of that in any of the programs with which you have worked? Heidi, can we start with you?
Creo que efectos negativos no podemos contar ahorita, sino porque le hemos dado un poquito más de atención tanto a la desnutrición aguda como la desnutrición crónica en este tiempo.
We think we cannot report any negative side effects because we have been focusing on acute and severe malnutrition in the programs.
Nos hace falta trabajar más, especialmente a nivel de comunidad. En el caso de Guatemala, pues tenemos 25 idiomas por los cuales tenemos que trabajar mucho ahí a nivel comunitario.
We still have a lot of work to do. We have, at the community level, as you may know, we have 25 different languages, different communities. So it's a hard work.
Puede ser una de las barreras que encontramos para poder llegar hasta los niños con desnutrición aguda.
This is one big barrier to overcome, to treat children with malnutrition.
Thank you. Dr. Buddha, did you want to come in on that one?
So on the potential adverse effects of MAM, particularly in community settings, one has to remember that in the context of community health worker programs, these community health workers by and large don't do nutrition only, unless they are created as a vertical cadre. And we have clearly enough evidence now from the potential integration of some of the CMAM into the Lady Health Workers program and also that of civic society linked community health workers, that there is displacement, that this is relatively easier to do and just the management and the logistics of getting food commodities into households takes away from much of the preventive and promotive work that they are doing. So I think while I personally have no issues in terms of severe acute malnutrition management in facility and community settings and using some of the existing cadres of health workers to make that available, I think one needs to be very, very careful without the disaggregated information on risk factors that we have for moderate malnutrition of expanding that, because it does feed into infant and young child feeding promotion, and particularly in food secure households as to what does it do in terms of displacement. The second big issue is most of these programs are in the context of short-term availability of resources, sometimes emergencies and its consequences. When they disappear, when those programs and funding disappear, you've left the community much worse off than you started off with. So I think a very clear policy message for any country to put these programs in place is what happens once the commodity runs out, once the resources run out. And we have clear, again, evidence from following the floods in Pakistan that that indeed happened. And it had a serious negative impact on those communities being receptive to subsequent interventions. So I think a lot more work is needed in this space to make sure we don't do more harm.
Thank you. Josephine had a series of issues nested in her comments and question, but I wrote down to you, leadership role, using correct data, what do you do about influx of products? Obey, do you want to?
I think the way I understood her question first is who takes the leadership in the. To my view, if I'm coming from the government, I'm responsible to people, to sons and daughters of Tanzania. I think the government should take the role, leading role, to coordinate, not only to do that, but to coordinate to make sure the data which is there is really the correct one and consistent with the national interventions and programs. So that one, to me, I would say the government should really take role in that, in coordinating all the research institutions and the universities to have the correct data. The other thing which you had raised was the non-emergent setting. I think in most countries, I'll talk of Tanzania, we know which districts are prone to shortage of food in every year. We know also there are emergencies which happen because of bad weathers or the influx of pesticide and which can destroy the crops. But most of the time we have the systems, we have the disaster management approaches in which we deal with emergencies. But we have the systems in place where these districts are prone. So what do? There are mechanisms in place to make sure they are reached in a timely manner. So there are two ways of looking at it. There's those in emergency, which there's a way of responding to it in an emergency fashion, but there is these ones which for sure these districts are really prone to problems. Thank you.
And the final question for this morning's session, the representative of Ministry of Health from Tanzania, but it's not unique to Tanzania, what I would call sustainability, that governments are struggling financially, and what would you advise once partner money, it's one issue of sustainability, is removed? Mir, do you want to comment on that one?
Thank you. Actually, it is very difficult to address the huge number of MAM patients in the community, and such a country like where the disaster is very much prone, or the another settings where the food safety and food quality is questionable. So it's in Bangladesh perspectives we want we addressing these problems by the 13 ministries within an umbrella. They are working for addressing this situation actually, and it is actually very much difficult to address the shortage of resources and logistics supplies and some others supplementations. So in terms of resources, it is very difficult to address, because in the health system, just nutrition is a part of the health programs. So the less budget in the health system and very less budget in the nutrition programs. So it is actually not.
Yeah, Obey.
I don't want to advise my colleague because we came together. But generally, what I'm saying is, I mean, as the government needs to take leadership in making sure to have the evidence. People do not vote for UNICEF representative in Tanzania. They don't vote for WHO, but they vote for the President of the United Republic of Tanzania. So we are responsible to people. Yes, we need support, but I think we should build the systems which are sustainable, and to make sure that all, and this is unique to every country, that we need to build and to be in the forefront to make sure we take the leadership role. But we also acknowledge the support, but make the support sustainable in our system. Thank you.
What a perfect note to end on. The agenda does talk about wrap-up comments from the chair. I can't possibly do justice to the richness of both the presentations, panel discussions, and questions from the audience, but one observation from a single individual, me, I've been impressed throughout this morning, both with the presenters, participants, over coffee, the amount of passion that exists in the audience about this topic, and I think that passion funneled will make a large difference as we go forward in thinking about MAM. So I'm just going to do what I call top line or highlights. I started off this morning saying there really were two questions that run throughout this session, and they'll run throughout the rest of the conference. One is, what do we know? And I think we need to be clear. We know a lot. We're not starting with a blank piece of paper. Francesco's presentation presented a lot of data. Clearly, MAM continues to be a severe public health problem, requires attention. Different areas of the world are affected differently. Patrick then went on to talk about evidence from systematic reviews. And again, I'd like to highlight positives. Despite all the flaws in the different studies, the different systematic reviews, there were commonalities. And the commonality being food supplements can work in treating MAM and SAM, and there are a variety of products, and this will be discussed a lot throughout the next 2.5 days. One of my takeaway messages from Dr. Butta's presentation is we've made progress in our evidence-based, and even just looking at Lancet Series 1 versus Lancet Series 2, I think, again, my bias, we really had a lot more information. In Lancet Series 1, for example, there was a really, really light touch on nutrition-sensitive development, much more serious, because of emerging data, serious analysis and discussion of that in Lancet Series 2. Despite the fact that we know a lot, there's a lot we don't know. And so that was the second issue that'll run through, or theme that'll run through the rest of the conference. What are the gaps in our knowledge? I like the term Dr. Butta used of, and I'm going to plagiarize it, nutrition blind spots. And there obviously are nutrition blind spots. Again, without going into detail, adolescent women, fetal factors affecting growth after birth, and we could go on and on. Second, evidence, 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 quality, quality, quality. Not surprisingly, this is a theme that has come out throughout, and without attention to improving data quality, it makes it very different to more effectively use research and science to link to policies and programs. UN group, again, my takeaway from that was the different UN groups are doing a lot, but that there's now more attention to getting away from silos and thinking about cross-fertilization across the different UN agencies. Again, my sense, and I don't think David Nabarro talked about this yesterday, but my sense is that SUN has helped that process by having a country focal point for the country and also a donor focal point. Hopefully evidence will emerge. Need to know a lot more about who are we reaching. The country panel here, I think, is a great example, again, of what David Nabarro mentioned yesterday, these learning groups, where we look at different experiences, different areas of the world, and how do we begin to understand context, successes, etc. Capacity, not surprisingly, comes up over and over again. We have a morning's cheering session on capacity, and we'll talk about that a lot more. Let me just end with my final comment, because as I was sitting here, we've all had experiences where we're trying to work with different groups, and in a prior professional life, I was a political appointee in the Clinton administration, and we'd muse about, because we'd get a lot of criticism, why don't you get, as government, why don't you get more done? And my response to that was, well, in part, it's a four-letter word. I'm not going to be obscene. The four-letter word is TURF, turf. And we spent so much time non-productively fighting these battles that, when you look back, didn't really make much sense across different agencies, across different groups of stakeholders. And one of the reasons I've been so pleased, and again I thank IAEA for this, one of the reasons I've been so pleased to be involved in this is the agency has succeeded, not only made a concerted effort, but has succeeded in bringing the range of stakeholders together, and they've listened to them. And that's impressive. And I think as we go forward, whether it's leadership at the country level, civil society, UN groups, bilaterals, researchers, to the extent that we can have this mutual respect to hear each other's comments, even though they may differ, I think moving forward we will make enormous success. And in Lancet Series 3, maybe, Dr. Butta, we'll see the evidence base to look at progress that's been made. Lunchtime, we are due back here at 1:30 for session 2. Enjoy.